You ever have one of those moments where the universe gently, but firmly, smacks you upside the head? Like, hey, pay attention, this one's important. Mine happened in the most mundane setting possible, the cereal aisle of a grocery store. To set the stage, it was a Tuesday afternoon, that sweet spot where the morning rush has cleared out, but the after-work crowd hasn't descended yet. I was meandering through the store with no real urgency, just grabbing essentials. At the time, I thought I was living a pretty solid life. Job I didn't hate, decent apartment, and a social circle that could fill a group chat, but wouldn't help me move furniture. You know, fine. Not great, not bad. Fine. Anyway, there I was standing in front of what must have been 80 different boxes of cereal. I was trying to decide between frosted mini wheats, practical but sweet, and some trendy organic thing with a name like Oat Clusters of Virtue. That's when I heard a loud crash behind me, like someone had dropped a whole cartload of canned goods. I turned around, expecting to see a mortified shopper or maybe a rogue toddler, but what I saw instead stopped me cold. It was an elderly woman, sprawled out on the floor, her wire-framed glasses sitting askew on the ground next to her. A small group of people had already gathered, but they were doing that classic human thing where everyone kind of hovers awkwardly, waiting for someone else to take charge. So I stepped forward, not really thinking, and crouched down next to her. Now, I'm no medical expert, but I do have a very practical skill set. I've watched a lot of Grey's Anatomy and YouTube tutorials on basic first aid. I asked if she was okay and introduced myself like we were meeting at a dinner party instead of on a linoleum floor next to the Cheerios. Her name was Betty, and she tripped on her own shopping bag, which was one of those reusable ones with handles just long enough to be a hazard. She assured me she was fine, but there was something about the way her hand trembled as she tried to push herself up that told me otherwise. I convinced her to stay put for a minute while I did what any rational adult would do in a situation like this. I flagged down a store employee and panicked slightly. To their credit, the staff was great. They called for help, brought Betty some water, and offered her one of those tiny deli chairs that's really just a stool in denial. Meanwhile, I stayed crouched by her side, talking about nothing in particular. Weather, grandchildren, the absurd price of avocados, just to keep her company. Here's where things took a turn. As we waited for the paramedics, Betty started to cry. Not a big, dramatic sob, but quiet tears that pooled at the edges of her eyes and slipped down her wrinkled cheeks. I asked her if she was in pain or scared, but she shook her head and said, "I'm just so embarrassed. I hate being a burden." And man, that hit me harder than I expected. I reassured her that she wasn't a burden, that stuff like this happens to everyone, but she just gave me this small, sad smile and said, "You'll understand when you're older." The paramedics arrived soon after and whisked her away with the efficiency of people who've done this 100 times. I never saw Betty again, but that little interaction stuck with me long after I left the store. The thing is, I couldn't stop thinking about what she said. I hate being a burden. It was such a raw, honest fear. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized how often that same worry had shown up in my own life, disguised as independence or pride. Like the time I moved to a new city and refused to ask my coworkers for help, even when I got hopelessly lost on my way to a team lunch. Or the months I struggled through a breakup without leaning on my friends because I didn't want to dump my problems on them. It's like I'd been carrying this invisible rulebook that said I had to handle everything on my own, even when it sucked. Betty's words made me question why I, and so many people apparently, felt like asking for help or showing vulnerability was some kind of moral failing. Why was it easier to feel shame than to admit I needed support? I didn't have an answer then, and honestly, I'm still figuring it out, but that random Tuesday in the cereal aisle was the first time I really started to notice the pattern. Since then, I've been trying to rewrite that rule book. I say trying because, let's be real, unlearning decades of self-imposed nonsense is not a quick process. But I've made little changes. I've asked a friend to help me assemble IKEA furniture without apologizing 6 times for taking up their Saturday. I've called my mom just to vent, instead of pretending everything's fine. And you know what? Not once has anyone made me feel like a burden. If anything, it's made my relationship stronger. Turns out people kind of like being there for each other. Who knew? So, that's my story. A random, seemingly insignificant moment that ended up teaching me a lesson I didn't know I needed. Now I'm curious. Have you ever had an experience like that? A small event or interaction that stuck with you and quietly changed the way you see the world? I'd love to hear your stories if you feel like sharing. No pressure, of course, but I'm here, crouched in the metaphorical cereal aisle, ready to listen. Let's start a new story. It started with a missed alarm. Normally, that would have sent me into a spiral of panic, fumbling for keys, skipping breakfast, and cursing the universe for ruining my plans. But for some reason, that morning I just didn't care. The sun had already risen, spilling soft light through the gaps in my curtains. And instead of rushing, I sat on the edge of my bed, letting the quiet hum of the world outside seep into me. The day wasn't going to follow any schedule, and for once, I decided to let it lead. I grabbed an old backpack, one of those with frayed edges that feels like it's lived as much as you have, stuffed in a notebook, a half-empty water bottle, and the first book I could grab from my nightstand. I didn't have a destination in mind, but something about the way the air smelled, like sun-warmed pavement and faintly blooming flowers, made me want to wander. So I did. The train station was buzzing, people shuffling through their lives with bags and headphones and distant gazes. I bought a ticket to the next random town listed on the departures board, a name I barely recognized, and boarded without thinking twice. The rhythmic clatter of the train against the tracks had this hypnotic quality, and I found myself staring out the window, watching as the city melted into rolling fields and clusters of trees. There was a simplicity to it, the kind that makes you forget everything you're supposed to be worrying about. When the train pulled into the station, I stepped onto the platform and was greeted by the scent of coffee and something sweet, maybe cinnamon. I followed the aroma down a cobblestone street until I found the source. A tiny cafe tucked between two brick buildings, its front window painted with curling golden letters. Inside, it was all warm wood and soft lighting, with shelves of books lining the walls and a record player spinning something soft and jazzy in the corner. It was the kind of place that made you feel like time didn't exist, like you'd stepped into a pocket of the world where nothing could go wrong. I ordered a cappuccino and a pastry, and as I waited, an older man sitting by the window caught my eye. He had this air about him, like he belonged to a different era, with a well-worn fedora and a leather satchel resting against his chair. He smiled at me, that kind of genuine, unhurried smile that makes you feel seen, and nodded toward the empty seat across from him. I hesitated for a second, then shrugged. Why not? His voice was deep and deliberate, like every word had weight. He told me he'd been a sailor once, that he'd seen the world from the deck of a ship and learned its secrets from strangers in port towns. He spoke of nights under skies so full of stars they made you believe in magic, of storms that reminded you how small you were, and of the quiet, steady rhythm of waves that felt like a heartbeat. I don't know if everything he said was true, but it didn't matter. It was the kind of storytelling that wraps around you like a blanket, that makes you feel like you're part of something bigger. At some point, the barista brought my order to the table, and I realized I'd completely forgotten about the pastry. I offered it to the old man, who accepted it with a laugh and a toast in my direction, as if we were sharing a bottle of fine wine instead of a flaky, sugar-dusted croissant. We talked until the sunlight streaming through the window turned golden, and then, as if he could sense the moment slipping away, he tipped his hat and left, disappearing into the evening without a goodbye. I didn't even think to ask his name. I wandered out of the cafe and found myself at the edge of a park. The trees were glowing with the last light of the day, their leaves rustling softly in the breeze. A small group of musicians had set up near a fountain, playing a mix of folk and classical, their melodies blending into the sounds of the birds settling in for the night. I sat on a bench and let the music wash over me, the notes curling around my thoughts like tendrils of smoke. There was a clarity to that moment, a sense of being exactly where I was supposed to be. It wasn't that the day had been extraordinary in any traditional sense. There had been no grand revelations or life-changing events. But everything had fit together so effortlessly, like pieces of a puzzle I hadn't realized I'd been trying to solve. I felt connected, not just to the place or the people I'd met, but to myself in a way that was rare and deeply comforting. By the time I made my way back to the train station, the sky had turned a deep indigo, stars just beginning to prick through the darkness. The ride home was quiet, the train car nearly empty, and I let my head rest against the window, the cool glass grounding me. I thought about the old sailor, the cafe, the music, and the way the day had unfolded like it had been written just for me. It was as if the universe had conspired to remind me of something simple and profound, that sometimes you don't have to chase meaning. Sometimes you just have to let it find you. When I finally stepped through my front door, there was a strange sense of stillness, like the house was waiting for me to return and fill it with the stories I'd collected. I set my bag down, kicked off my shoes, and stood there for a moment, feeling the echoes of the day vibrating in my chest. It was a kind of harmony I didn't know I'd been missing, a melody I wished I could bottle and carry with me forever. Have you ever had a day when it felt like life was playing the perfect melody just for you? Let's start a new story. We met at a little coffee shop on the corner of a busy street. It wasn't our first date, but it was early enough in the relationship that everything still felt slightly uncertain. Every touch of his hand, every shared glance, felt like the start of a sentence I was too afraid to finish. He was holding the door open for me when a gust of wind sent my scarf tumbling to the ground. I laughed awkwardly, embarrassed, as I tried to retrieve it. But before I could, he'd already picked it up, carefully brushing off a speck of dirt before wrapping it gently back around my neck. That might sound like a small thing, but there was something about the way he did it, how deliberate and kind the gesture was, that made me pause. He adjusted it like he'd done it 1,000 times before, even though he hadn't. "Can't let you catch a cold," he said with a smile that lingered in his eyes more than on his lips. It wasn't just what he said, but how he said it, like the idea of me being uncomfortable, even for a moment, was unacceptable to him. My cheeks warmed in a way that had nothing to do with the scarf. We found a table by the window, the light from the street lamp casting shadows that danced across his face as he talked. I don't even remember most of what we said that night, to be honest. There were the usual conversations about work, hobbies, favorite movies, but underneath it all was this easy rhythm, like we were walking on the same invisible thread, one neither of us wanted to let go of. At some point, I casually mentioned my grandmother's recipes, how much I missed her cooking and how I'd been trying and failing to recreate her famous cinnamon rolls. I laughed, shrugging it off as no big deal. But he leaned in, resting his chin on his hand, and asked me question after question about her. What was she like? What was my favorite memory of her? Did I still have her handwritten recipes? Or were they just in my head? Nobody had ever asked me about her like that before. Most people just nod and move on, but he wasn't just listening. He was absorbing every word like he wanted to keep those little pieces of her safe for me. By the time I realized I'd been rambling, my eyes were misty, and he was still watching me with that quiet intensity, as if I'd just handed him a secret he planned to guard with his life. After a while, he glanced out the window and nodded toward the street. "Do you trust me?" he asked, standing up and holding out his hand. I hesitated, not sure what I was agreeing to, but his expression was so earnest that I found myself following him without question. We ended up in the middle of a quiet park, where the night air was crisp, and the world felt miles away from the noise of the city. He stopped near a patch of grass, motioned for me to wait, and jogged to a nearby stand of trees. When he returned, he was holding a sprig of wildflowers he'd picked, their petals slightly wilted but still lovely. "They reminded me of you," he said, handing them to me with a sheepish grin. "Beautiful, even when the world's a little rough around the edges." I didn't know what to say. Nobody had ever compared me to wildflowers before, or, honestly, to anything, and it wasn't the flowers themselves that moved me. It was the thoughtfulness behind them, the way he seemed to see beauty in the smallest, quietest things. In me, we walked back slowly, the flowers in my hand, neither of us in a rush to leave the moment behind. When we reached my apartment building, he turned to me and said, "I know this sounds silly, but I want to learn how to make those cinnamon rolls with you. Maybe we won't get them right, but I figure it's worth a try." I couldn't speak for a moment because my throat was tight with a feeling I didn't yet have a name for. But I nodded, smiling so hard it hurt, and somehow managed to say, "I'd like that." He kissed me goodnight then, just a brush of his lips against mine, but it was enough to send my heart tumbling in ways I hadn't known it could. It's been years since that night. We've burned more batches of cinnamon rolls than I can count, but we've also perfected the recipe. We still make them together sometimes on lazy Sunday mornings, and every time I taste the warm, gooey sweetness of them, I think about how they started, not in my grandmother's kitchen, but with a boy who cared enough to ask about her. Have you ever had a moment on a date that stayed with you forever? Let's start a new story. This morning, I found myself standing at the corner of Main and Fifth, waiting for the pedestrian light to change. It was just one of those mornings, cool but not cold, a faint drizzle slicking the pavement, and a city humming with its usual quiet urgency. As I stood there, clutching a lukewarm coffee and scanning the crowd, something small caught my attention. A group of people waiting for the bus. Every single one of them had their heads tilted downward, illuminated by that faint bluish glow of their phones. Nobody said a word, but somehow they all seemed synchronized, like the ticking hands of a clock. For a moment, I felt like an outsider looking in, a traveler stumbling upon some curious custom in a foreign land. Here they were, these strangers, performing this unspoken ritual, bound together not by words or gestures, but by a shared participation in something unseen. It wasn't eerie exactly, it was oddly beautiful. Each person seemed to float in their own tiny bubble, yet those bubbles bumped gently against one another, all carried forward on the current of a city morning. I watched a young woman swipe furiously on her screen, her thumb moving with the precision of someone late to an appointment. Beside her, an older man hunched over his device, squinting as though deciphering some ancient text. Between them, a teenager stood with his earphones in, head bobbing ever so slightly, probably lost in a beat I'd never recognize. Nobody spoke, nobody even glanced up, but when the bus arrived, the whole group moved as one, an unthinking organism that stepped, boarded, and settled with the grace of a rehearsed dance. Then the light changed, and I crossed the street. A delivery cyclist zoomed past me, swerving deftly between cars, his backpack marked with a logo I'd seen 1,000 times but couldn't quite remember. The scent of freshly baked bagels wafted out of a corner deli, mixing with the sharp tang of exhaust fumes. And in the midst of it all, someone laughed, a quick, sudden burst of joy that seemed to ripple through the air. I turned, trying to spot the source, but the laughter had already dissolved into the cacophony of the city, leaving only its echo. I passed a construction site where workers moved in a kind of noisy symphony, shouts, clangs, the steady rhythm of machinery, all blending into a soundtrack that was as much a part of the city as the traffic lights and pigeons. One man wiped his brow with a fluorescent glove, another adjusted his hard hat. They didn't seem to need words either. Their gestures were enough, as though their bodies spoke a language only they could understand. It struck me how much of our world operates like this, on a level so ordinary it's almost invisible. Even the smallest things seemed part of some grand design. The way a barista handed over a steaming cup with the exact same smile she'd probably offered 100 times already that day. The way people in a crowded elevator instinctively shuffled to make room without a single word exchanged. The way a toddler waddled past me on the sidewalk, his tiny hand wrapped around a balloon string, as if tethered to the sky. It made me think about how much of our lives are shaped by these tiny, unnoticed moments. A snippet of conversation overheard on the subway. The tap of an umbrella against the pavement. The way people instinctively step aside for someone in a hurry. None of it is planned, and yet all of it feels perfectly choreographed, like a dance we've all learned without realizing. By the time I reached the cafe where I like to spend my mornings, I couldn't shake the sense that I'd just traveled through a world both familiar and alien. I sat down, opened my laptop, and watched as more people filtered in, each one carrying their own invisible stories, their own private worlds. A man in a suit checked his watch, tapped his foot, and sighed. A woman with paint-stained hands ordered her coffee in a soft, lilting voice, her gaze drifting toward the sketches on the cafe walls. Even here, in this small, cozy space, the quiet symphony continued. I realized then that what I was feeling wasn't really curiosity or even wonder. It was gratitude. Gratitude for the way these small, nearly invisible things knit us together, creating a world that is both chaotic and deeply connected. It's easy to overlook, to take for granted, but when you stop and really see it, it's impossible not to be amazed. So, here's my question for you. What part of our everyday society makes you feel like a traveler in your own world? Let's start a new story. I was standing in my kitchen the other day, minding my own business, when I reached for the salt shaker and realized it was empty. Not a crisis, but mildly inconvenient considering I'd just sprinkled a very questionable amount of garlic powder onto my scrambled eggs. I sighed dramatically, as one does when facing life's small irritations, and opened the pantry to find a refill. That's when it happened. My entire worldview was rewritten by a plastic container of Morton salt. Let me explain. For as long as I've been alive, and we're talking a solid 3 decades here, I've had this belief, no, this truth that salt came from the ocean. That was its whole shtick, wasn't it? Salty sea, salty salt. But there I was, standing in the fluorescent hum of my kitchen, staring at the back of the Morton container, reading the words harvested from ancient underground deposits. Underground? What underground? How had I made it this far in life without realizing salt was basically dug out of the earth like some kind of mineralized potato? I know there's sea salt too, but the fact that table salt came from ancient caves, or whatever deposits meant, shook me to my core. I sat down with my half-seasoned eggs and stared at the container like it was a cryptic message from a parallel universe. And suddenly, as if the salt gods themselves were having a chuckle at my expense, it hit me. What else don't I know? What other basic, obvious facts have I been blissfully ignorant of my entire life? Am I walking around with all kinds of misplaced confidence about things that would make a 5th grader roll their eyes? That's when the memory of my old roommate, Emily, popped into my head. She once asked me, with complete seriousness, if jellyfish were made of jelly. I'd laughed so hard I almost fell off the couch. But now I realized I had no high ground to stand on. Jellyfish, salt. Who's to say what else the world has been quietly keeping from me while I strut around thinking I've got it all figured out? The salt revelation spiraled, as these things tend to do. My brain started rifling through random facts I'd taken for granted. Like, why do bananas turn brown? Do they oxidize? Or is it some other science-why thing I've just nodded along to without actually understanding? And what's the deal with bird migration? How do birds know where to go? Are they just winging it? Pun unintended, but also kind of intended. And don't even get me started on rainbows. I'm pretty sure I understood them when I was 10, but now, the mechanics of light refraction are a blur. Literally, as I sat there spiraling into a mild existential crisis, something unexpected happened. I started laughing. Not the little chuckle you let out when a funny thought crosses your mind, but the full-on, head thrown back, belly shaking kind of laugh. It wasn't just about the salt anymore. It was about all the tiny, hilarious ways we humans stumble through life thinking we're so smart, only to be smacked in the face with the simplest truths. And honestly, it felt kind of wonderful, like a reminder that life is a lot bigger and more intricate than we give it credit for. And that's okay. Maybe it's even better that way. Later that evening, I told the whole salt story to a friend, and they laughed so hard they choked on their tea. Then they confessed they'd only recently learned that pineapples don't grow on trees. I always thought they were like coconuts, they said, wiping their eyes. You know, falling from the sky, ready to bonk someone on the head like a cartoon gag. That sent us both into another fit of laughter. And I swear, for a solid hour, we just traded these ridiculous little misconceptions about the world. It was like a bonding ritual, one absurdity at a time. Here's the thing. For all the big, dramatic moments in life, it's these small, funny ones that stick with me. They sneak up on you when you're least expecting it. A laugh over breakfast, a sudden revelation about the way the world works, a shared moment of, wait, you thought that too. It's humbling in the best way. Like a cozy reminder that we're all just muddling through, learning and relearning as we go. And maybe that's the point. Maybe life isn't about having it all figured out, but about enjoying the surprise when you realize you don't. So, now I have to ask, what's your version of the salt shaker moment? What's something ridiculously simple or obvious that you only just discovered, and it made you stop and laugh at yourself? I can't wait to hear what else the world has been quietly keeping secret from all of us. Let's start a new story. I never thought a flat tire would lead to one of the best days of my life. It was supposed to be a straightforward road trip with my dog, Maisie, to visit my old college roommate in a small mountain town a few hours away. I'd packed snacks, an absurd amount of coffee, and an overambitious playlist that would have needed 2 extra days to finish. Everything was on track until I heard the unmistakable thwack, thwack, thwack of a dying tire. I pulled over to the side of a winding, tree-lined road, the kind that looks idyllic until you're stranded on it. Cell service was non-existent, of course. I'm not completely helpless when it comes to cars, but I quickly discovered my spare tire was flat too. Rookie mistake. I could feel Maisie's eyes judging me as she sprawled in the back seat, her tail thumping like she somehow found this hilarious. As I stared at the useless spare, a beat-up old truck rounded the bend and slowed to a stop. Out stepped a man who looked like he'd just walked out of a country song. Faded flannel, a straw hat, and a beard so big it could probably host a family of sparrows. "Need a hand?" he asked, as if the situation wasn't glaringly obvious. His name was Walt, and after some good-natured ribbing about my lack of tire preparedness, he offered to drive me and Maisie into town to find a repair shop. Maisie immediately liked him, which was my first sign this guy wasn't a serial killer. Still, getting into a stranger's truck with no cell service is the sort of decision I could already hear my mom lecturing me about. But Walt had a warm smile, and I didn't see many other options. So, we climbed in, and off we went, bouncing along the road in his truck that smelled like wood shavings and peppermint. The nearest town wasn't exactly bustling. It had one gas station, a diner, and a general store that seemed to sell everything from fishing gear to ice cream cones. The repair shop, Walt explained, was run by his cousin Earl, who wouldn't charge an arm and a leg if I was willing to wait for him to get back from lunch. Walt said this like it was the most normal thing in the world, and I decided to roll with it. To kill time, Walt suggested we grab some pie at the diner. Best cherry pie in the state, he claimed, and honestly, I didn't need much convincing. The diner was one of those places frozen in time, with vinyl booths and a jukebox that probably hadn't worked since the 80s. The waitress, who clearly knew Walt, greeted him with a still rescuing city folk before sliding 2 plates of pie onto the counter. She even brought Maisie a bowl of water, which Maisie lapped up like she'd been trekking through the desert. The pie was, in fact, the best cherry pie I'd ever tasted. Walt told me stories about growing up in the area, how he and Earl used to race dirt bikes down the trails, and how one time they tried to catch a bear cub because they thought it'd make a cool pet. Spoiler, it didn't. I told him about my overly ambitious playlist, and we ended up laughing about how I could name every Taylor Swift song, but couldn't change a tire to save my life. When Earl finally returned to the shop, he confirmed that my tire could be patched, but it'd take a couple of hours. Instead of waiting around, Walt suggested we take a short hike to a nearby creek where, according to him, time just stops. Again, Maisie was all in, so I figured why not. We left Earl to his work and followed Walt down a narrow path into the woods. The creek was stunning, like something out of a movie. The water was so clear you could see the pebbles on the bottom, and the air smelled like pine and wildflowers. Maisie wasted no time plunging in, splashing around like a puppy even though she's 8 years old and usually too dignified for that sort of thing. Walt pointed out the best spots for skipping stones, and we spent what felt like hours seeing who could get the most skips. He won, but only because he grew up there. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. At one point, he pulled a harmonica out of his pocket, because of course he had a harmonica, and started playing a tune I didn't recognize but immediately loved. Maisie flopped onto the grass, soaked and happy, while I leaned against a tree and just soaked it all in. The whole scene was so far removed from the stress of everyday life that it felt like I'd stepped into another world. By the time we made it back to the shop, Earl had my car ready to go. I tried to pay Walt for the ride and the impromptu tour, but he waved me off. "Just pay it forward," he said with a grin. I promised I would, though I wasn't sure how I could possibly match the kindness he'd shown me that day. As I drove away, Maisie snoring softly in the back seat, I couldn't stop smiling. What started as a stressful setback turned into one of those rare days where everything feels exactly as it should. I never saw Walt again, but sometimes I think about that creek, the pie, and the way he played that harmonica, and it still makes me smile. Have you ever had a moment that felt crazy but left only happy memories? Let's start a new story. I woke up this morning to the sound of my alarm clock singing. Not buzzing or beeping, but genuinely singing a jaunty little tune about seizing the day. It sounded suspiciously like my grandma's voice, and for a moment I wondered if I'd finally lost it. But no, there she was, the clock, trilling away cheerfully in a language I didn't understand but somehow felt deep in my bones. I turned it off with a smile and a muttered, "Thanks, Nana," and the clock replied, "Anytime, sweetie," before falling silent. This is just how things are now, I suppose. The air outside my bedroom smelled faintly of hot chocolate, even though I hadn't made any. I stepped out of bed, and my feet landed on the softest patch of carpet I've ever felt. The thing is, I don't own carpet. It was supposed to be wood flooring, but today it felt like standing on a cloud that whispered compliments every time I took a step. "Nice balance," it murmured as I tiptoed to the kitchen. "Looking good today." I almost said thanks, but then I thought, why encourage it? The flowers under my window were already awake, stretching their petals in the sun and chatting amongst themselves. They noticed me peeking out and immediately turned my way. "Morning, sleepyhead," chirped the daffodil, her yellow crown wobbling as though she were stifling a laugh. The tulips nodded politely and offered a group good morning. The roses were the most dramatic of the bunch, as always. "Well, if it isn't our darling human," one said, bowing so low his petals almost touched the soil. I waved back, too groggy to argue with them about their flair for theatrics. As I walked outside, the weather greeted me like an old friend. The sun wasn't just shining. It was radiating warmth that felt personal, like it had crafted the day specifically for me. A gentle breeze rolled in, carrying with it the faint scent of cinnamon and vanilla, even though I lived nowhere near a bakery. It wrapped itself around me in a playful swirl and whispered, "Looking sharp today." I was still in pajamas, but I'll take the compliment. Walking to the corner store was, as always, an adventure. Passers-by no longer bother with hellos or awkward nods. Now, we simply glance at each other and share thoughts directly. It's a silent conversation, like trading postcards in our heads. I passed a woman walking her dog, a magnificent golden retriever wearing what appeared to be a top hat, and we both burst into laughter in our minds at the same time. "Where does he shop for hats?" I thought, and she sent back, "He makes them himself. He's very crafty." The dog winked at me as I passed. I didn't question it. At the store, things had gotten even weirder. The apples were holding a union meeting in the produce section, loudly demanding better refrigeration conditions. A cantaloupe tried to shush them, but they ignored him. The cashier was a raccoon in a little red vest who rang up my items with surprising efficiency. I was about to ask why a raccoon was manning the register when he said, without looking up, "Health insurance lady." Times are tough. Fair enough. Back at home, the mail had arrived, delivered not by the usual carrier, but by a very dignified crow. He tapped on my window with his beak until I opened it, then dropped the letters on my coffee table and gave a sharp caw, which I'm pretty sure was crow speak for "you're welcome." One of the letters was from my landlord, apologizing for the rent increase, but including a handwritten coupon for free ice cream. So I guess it balanced out. Lunch was a quiet affair, or as quiet as it could be when your sandwich keeps offering life advice. "You know," the turkey on rice said between bites, "you really ought to take more risks. Have you considered skydiving?" I ignored him until dessert, when my slice of cheesecake chimed in with, "Don't listen to him. Risks are overrated. Stick to what makes you happy." Cheesecake has a point. The afternoon passed in a dreamy haze of soft light and unexpected encounters. The clouds shaped themselves into a live-action puppet show for my entertainment, reenacting famous historical events with surprising accuracy. A snail wearing a tiny hat tried to sell me a map to buried treasure, and when I declined, he tipped his hat and said, "Your loss." Even the traffic outside sounded more like a symphony than a cacophony, the horns and engines harmonizing in ways that should have been impossible but were somehow perfect. As evening fell, I sat on my porch and watched the stars slowly flicker to life. They didn't just shine, they danced. They swirled and waltzed across the sky, moving in time to some celestial music only they could hear. My neighbor waved at me from her own porch, where she was sipping tea from a cup that occasionally refilled itself. I waved back, and for a moment, we shared a silent, contented understanding. This world, with all its absurdities, was somehow exactly right. Before bed, I heard the flowers whispering again, their voices soft and soothing as they wished me good night. The breeze ruffled my hair one last time, and the moon smiled down with the kind of warmth you'd expect from an old friend. Lying in bed, I couldn't help but wonder, if this is how things are now, what other surprises might tomorrow bring? So, here's my question for you. If you woke up in a world where the strange was the new normal, how would you spend your day? Would you talk to the flowers, chat with strangers in silence, or maybe follow a snail's treasure map? I'd love to hear your version of this delightful madness. Let's start a new story. I was thinking the other day about how strange and wonderful modern life is, especially when you compare it to even a couple of decades ago. Take communication, for instance. We've gone from handwritten letters that took weeks to deliver, to email that was a little faster, to texting that's instantaneous. And now we're at the stage where people send each other voice notes because typing is too much effort. Not just that, but half the time the voice notes are the verbal equivalent of a post-it note. Hey, just checking in, or remember to buy bread. It's like we've come full circle to reinventing telegrams, but with emojis and giggles in the background. Speaking of emojis, can we pause for a second to appreciate the art form that is a well-placed thumbs up or side eye? There's a whole language there that we've collectively agreed on without a formal meeting. The other day, my friend sent me 5 different emojis to describe her weekend, and honestly, it told a better story than a paragraph ever could. It's like we've traded words for hieroglyphics again. Only now they include a tiny taco and a suspiciously cheerful ghost. Even the way we celebrate things has taken on a new life. Birthdays, for example. Remember when you just have a small party at home with a homemade cake and maybe some balloons? Now it's Instagram posts with carefully curated photo dumps, matching color palettes, and captions like "grateful for another trip around the sun." Don't get me wrong, I love a good aesthetic, but sometimes I wonder if we've gone from celebrating the moment to producing it for an audience. On the plus side, you do get a lot of leftover cake because apparently the picture comes first and the eating is secondary. Weddings are another fun one. They used to be about showing up, saying vows, and maybe dancing awkwardly to a band that played Sweet Caroline 3 times. Now there are choreographed first dances, drones filming aerial shots of the happy couple, and hashtags to make sure every single guest contributes to the digital scrapbook. Don't even get me started on the themed photo booths. I went to one wedding where they had a steampunk corner, and the groom spent half the night trying to figure out how to operate a monocle. To be fair, the pictures turned out amazing. And it's not just the big milestones. It's the little things, too. Like grocery shopping. Remember when you'd go to the store with a list scribbled on the back of an envelope? These days, half the people in the aisle are staring at their phones because their partner is texting them real-time updates. They're out of almond milk. What now? Plus, thanks to delivery apps, you can now buy snacks in your pajamas at midnight and have them show up at your door within the hour. If that isn't the peak of human ingenuity, I don't know what is. Even how we relax has changed. TV used to be a communal event. Everyone gathered on the couch, watching the same show at the same time. Now, it's all streaming services and personal screens. My partner and I will sit in the same room, under the same blanket, but he's watching a documentary about space, and I'm binging a sitcom from 2007. Occasionally, we'll pause and compare notes like, "Did you know black holes can bend time?" Followed by, "Yeah, but did you see how awkward Ross was in season 3? It's oddly comforting in its own way. Let's not forget dating. There was a time when you met someone at a party, exchanged numbers, and spent weeks building up the courage to call. Now, you swipe, chat, meet for coffee, and by the second date, you've already Googled their entire life history. It's efficient, I'll give you that, but it does take away some of the mystery. On the other hand, there's something endearing about 2 people nervously sitting across from each other, already knowing they both like dogs and hate pineapple on pizza, but still pretending to be surprised. Even our rituals around food have evolved. Sunday dinners used to be a big family gathering with past dishes and second helpings. Now, they're just as likely to be brunch with bottomless mimosas, where half the table spends 15 minutes taking pictures of their eggs Benedict, while the other half tries not to eat the garnish by accident. I'm not complaining. It's delicious, and the photos do get better engagement than a family portrait ever did. What really gets me, though, is how we've managed to keep some traditions alive in the middle of all this change. People still bake cookies for the holidays, even if they're vegan and gluten-free now. Kids still dress up for Halloween, though the costumes are more elaborate and occasionally require a tutorial. And people still make New Year's resolutions, even if most of them revolve around getting more steps in because our watches nag us about it now. The world keeps moving forward, reinventing itself with every app update and viral trend. And yet, somehow, the heart of it all, connecting with others, celebrating life's little joys, and finding reasons to laugh, stays the same. We just have fancier tools and sillier rituals to get there. It's kind of beautiful in a chaotic, slightly absurd way. What's something in society today that makes you smile? Whether it's a quirky habit, a new tradition, or just a little moment that feels like modern magic, I'd love to hear it. Let's start a new story. You know that thing where you're trying to seem totally normal around someone you like, but instead you end up doing something that's basically a neon sign flashing. This person is weird. Yeah, that's me. Every single time. My specific brand of awkwardness, though, is kind of, well, here's the thing. I give crushes little secret nicknames. Not cute nicknames. Not sexy ones either. Oh no, that would make way too much sense. I give them full-on, completely unhinged, inside joke level nicknames that make zero sense to anyone but me. And sometimes, not even to me. Let me explain. A few months ago, I developed this massive crush on this guy at my gym. He was tall, super nice, and always wore this battered Star Wars hoodie. Naturally, in my head, I started calling him Darth Flexor. Yes, like Darth Vader, but for someone who bench presses. I swear, it made sense at the time. Every time I'd see him, I'd think, oh no, here comes Darth Flexor, master of cardio and my heart. And then I'd have to physically stop myself from laughing, because how do you explain to someone why you're snorting in their direction mid-squat? It's not just gym people either. I once had a coworker I liked whose name was Scott, but for some inexplicable reason, my brain decided to rebrand him as Hot Sauce Scott. Why? To this day, I don't know. He didn't particularly like spicy food or exude a fiery personality, so your guess is as good as mine. Of course, when you've been internally calling someone hot sauce for weeks, the actual name starts to feel wrong. So one day, in the middle of the office kitchen, I accidentally greeted him with, "Hey, Hot Sco, Scott. Hi, Scott." And then just stood there trying to play it cool while holding a bagel I no longer had any plans to eat. The nicknames are just the start of my weirdness, though. If I'm really into someone, I take it one step further by creating these imaginary scenarios about what it would be like to hang out with them, but always in the most ridiculous ways possible. Like, I'll see someone ordering coffee, and my brain goes, what if we went on a date to a farm where we herded miniature goats together? Not, let's get a coffee, but goat herding. Because obviously nothing screams romance like tiny livestock and mutual sunburns. I think it's because I have this hopelessly romantic imagination that somehow defaults to Hallmark Channel on acid. There's no in-between. One time I liked this guy who played guitar, and my brain immediately decided we were destined to have some kind of dramatic Camelot serenade where he'd play a song for me, and I'd cry just a single, perfectly timed tear. Did I mention that I can't cry on cue, and that we were, at the time, co-workers in an office where the most romantic thing that ever happened was people ordering extra cheese on Pizza Fridays? Spoiler, no serenade ever happened. But for weeks, every time I saw him near the copy machine, my heart screamed, tonight is the night. The really tragic part? I can't keep these little quirks to myself forever. They inevitably slip out either because I'm bad at filtering my thoughts or because I get overconfident. Like with my friend's cousin, this guy I was crushing on hard. He was super sweet and liked baking. So in my mind, I'd been referring to him as Cinnabay. Adorable, right? Except I didn't mean to tell him that. But one night we were all hanging out, and he offered me a cinnamon roll he made, and my stupid brain decided that was the perfect time to say, "Wow, you're such a Cinnabay." Out loud, to his face. The silence that followed? Deafening. My brain? Exit stage left. But you know what's funny? These little quirks haven't ruined me completely. A few of my friends say it's endearing, or whatever, They laugh when I tell them about my latest nickname or goat herding fantasy. They say it makes me charmingly weird. I'm not sure if that's a compliment or just code for hopeless but entertaining. Either way, it's part of who I am, and I've learned to lean into it. Because at the end of the day, wouldn't it be boring to crush on someone and just be normal about it? So now I'm curious. Am I alone in this? Do you have any little dating quirks you've never told anyone about? Like, do you have secret rituals before a date? Do you plan your outfits based on their vibe or Google weird first date questions? Comment? Spirit. Make me feel better about my Darth Flexor habit. Let's start a new story. I was walking home from work one evening. The kind of evening where the air smells faintly of spring even though winter isn't quite ready to let go. It had been one of those grueling days where every little thing that could go wrong did. And I was half listening to a podcast, half spiraling into a mental list of everything I needed to fix tomorrow. My usual shortcut through the park seemed like a cruel joke at this point. So I opted for the longer route, weaving through unfamiliar side streets I'd never really paid attention to before. The streets felt off, but not in a scary way. More like they were somehow cleaner, quieter. It was like stepping into a movie set of a perfect neighborhood. Every house seemed just a little too picturesque. White picket fences, carefully trimmed hedges, porch swings that looked like they'd been handcrafted by a woodshop wizard. The air smelled faintly like fresh bread, even though I couldn't see a single bakery around. I passed a small garden enclosed by a low stone wall, the kind of place you'd expect to find overgrown and abandoned. But it was thriving. Lavender, sunflowers, vines heavy with purple blossoms I couldn't name. It felt like it was springing to life just for me. In the center of the garden was an elderly man with a neatly trimmed silver beard, wearing suspenders and the kind of hat I thought only existed in old oil paintings. He was sitting on a wooden stool, strumming a ukulele. The tune was strange, unfamiliar, and hauntingly beautiful. I couldn't place the melody, but it felt like a song I'd known my whole life. As I walked by, he glanced up, nodded, and smiled like we were old friends. "Nice night, isn't it?" he said. I stammered something like, "Yes, sure is," and kept walking, but I swear, as soon as I turned the corner, I couldn't hear the music anymore, even though I was certain I should have. Then came the bakery, except it wasn't there. Not really. Just the smell of warm cinnamon and sugar drifting down the street. A girl about 10 years old darted past me, clutching a paper bag in both hands, grinning like she'd just been handed treasure. "It's the last one," she called over her shoulder to nobody in particular. The bag crinkled, and I could have sworn I heard her giggle echo long after she turned a corner. My stomach growled in response. The next odd thing was the cat. A big, fat ginger cat with a little white bow tie on its collar sat perched on the edge of a fountain in a tiny square I didn't recognize. It looked me dead in the eye as if it had been expecting me. Now, I'm not usually a talk-to-animals person, but something about this cat felt different. I stopped walking. It meowed. Once, loud and insistent, then jumped down and started trotting toward a side alley. It paused at the mouth of the alley, glanced back at me, and meowed again. Against my better judgment, I followed. The alley was narrow, lined with ivy-covered walls and old-fashioned lampposts that flickered like candles. At the end of it was a wrought iron gate I was sure I'd never seen before, though it looked older than the buildings around it. The cat slipped through a gap in the bars and disappeared. I thought about leaving. I really did, but something about that gate pulled me in. When I pushed it open, I stepped into what can only be described as a secret garden. Trees twisted overhead in impossible shapes, their branches heavy with lanterns that glowed faintly in soft greens and golds. A narrow cobblestone path wound through beds of flowers that looked like they belonged in a dream. The air was warm, though it shouldn't have been, and I could hear the faint hum of music. Ukulele music, I realized, though there was no one around. I wandered through the garden, my heart racing, but not from fear. It felt like the world had tilted slightly, like I was seeing something I wasn't supposed to see. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it ended. I walked through another gate at the far end of the garden, and I was back on a normal street. My street. The air was colder, the magic gone. The suddenness of it all was jarring, like waking from a vivid dream. I turned to look behind me, but the gate wasn't there. Just a brick wall, solid and unremarkable. I got home that night and immediately tried to Google every detail of what I'd seen. The garden, the fountain, even the cat, nothing came up. I walked that route the next day, and the day after that, but the streets didn't feel the same. The houses weren't as perfect. The smells were gone. No mysterious garden, no gate, no cat with a bow tie. It feels ridiculous to even talk about it. Like maybe I imagined the whole thing in a haze of post-work exhaustion. But I can't shake the feeling that for just a moment, I stepped sideways into another world. Maybe it was just a trick of the light or my mind playing games with me. Or maybe it was something else entirely. Have you ever had a day where reality felt almost like a dream or a strange fairy tale? Let's start a new story. I was walking through the cereal aisle at the grocery store, minding my own business, focused on my mental checklist. Bread, eggs, something green so I could lie to myself about eating healthier. The same bland adult stuff as always. It was the usual fluorescent-lit monotony of weekday errands, with distant chatter and the faint squeak of a cartwheel that always seemed to be protesting its existence. Nothing special, nothing worth remembering, or so I thought. And then I saw it, a box of Cookie Crisp cereal, perched halfway up the shelf like a time machine waiting for me to notice it. Not the redesigned, boring version they have now. No, this one was dressed up in retro packaging as part of some limited edition throwback campaign, complete with the old-school mascot. A vaguely mischievous wolf grinning at me like he'd been waiting for years for me to turn this corner. I froze. 1 second, I was a tired adult in sneakers and a hoodie. The next, I was 8 years old again, standing in the cereal aisle with my mom, begging her to buy me Cookie Crisp like my life depended on it. I swear I could hear her voice as clear as day, saying, "That's not real breakfast, it's just cookies in a bowl." The indignation I used to feel bubbled up in me as if no time had passed at all. Of course, now I see she was absolutely right, but back then, the injustice of being denied such an obviously superior cereal was my greatest cross to bear. But it didn't stop there. It never does with nostalgia, does it? The second I touched that box, because of course I had to pick it up, I was completely untethered from the present. I remembered the jingles from the old commercials, that overly enthusiastic announcer yelling about Cookie Crisp like it was the secret to eternal happiness. I remembered the way the milk would turn into a slightly chocolatey slurry at the bottom of the bowl, which I considered the best part. I even remembered the cheap plastic spoons I collected from cereal boxes, each one a different neon color that I swore made the cereal taste better. For a moment, I wasn't holding a box of cereal in 2024. I was sitting cross-legged on the carpet in my childhood living room, surrounded by those clunky wooden-paneled TVs and VHS tapes. Saturday morning cartoons were on, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles if you must know, and I was eating Cookie Crisp straight out of the box like the feral little gremlin I was. It was the kind of day that didn't ask anything of you except to exist and enjoy. The kind of day you don't realize is magical until you've grown up and magic feels harder to come by. Standing there in the grocery store, I started to laugh softly to myself. Not an "oh, that's funny" laugh, but the kind that sneaks up on you when you're overwhelmed by something you didn't know you'd been missing. I put the box in my cart, even though I knew I wasn't really going to eat it. It wasn't about the cereal. It was about carrying that memory with me for just a little while longer, as if I could physically take it home and keep it safe. On my way to the checkout, I walked past the bakery section and was hit by another memory, so vivid it felt almost staged. The smell of fresh bread and sugar mingled in the air, and suddenly, I was in the kitchen with my grandma. She used to bake the most incredible cinnamon rolls on the weekends, and the whole house would smell like warm sugar and love. She'd always save the gooey centerpiece for me because she knew it was my favorite. I could practically hear her humming some old tune while she worked, her apron dusted with flour. That was the moment I realized how sneaky nostalgia can be. It doesn't knock politely and wait for you to invite it in. It barrels through the door like an old friend you haven't seen in years, bringing stories and smells and feelings you didn't even know you'd tucked away. 1 minute, you're comparing prices on laundry detergent, and the next, you're holding back tears because a smell reminded you of someone who loved you in a way you didn't fully appreciate until they were gone. I checked out with my cart, bread, eggs, Cookie Crisp, and that imaginary green item I forgot to actually grab, and stepped out into the parking lot. The sun was setting, and the sky was streaked with pinks and oranges so vivid they almost looked fake. I stood there for a moment, box of cereal in hand, feeling small but in a good way. It was one of those rare moments where the world seems to whisper to you, reminding you of all the tiny, beautiful things that make up a life. As I drove home, I started to wonder how many of these moments I'd missed because I was too busy rushing or worrying about something that wouldn't matter in a year. How many times had my brain been so full of to-do lists that I completely overlooked the quiet little gifts the past was trying to hand me? I made a promise to myself to pay more attention from now on, to let the nostalgia in when it came knocking, no matter how inconvenient it seemed at the time. When I got home, I poured myself a small bowl of Cookie Crisp, just one, and as I sat there crunching away, it wasn't as good as I remembered, but somehow, that didn't matter. It wasn't about the taste. It was about sitting there in my kitchen, feeling 8 years old again for a few fleeting minutes. So now I'm curious, what random moment has brought you back to those warm times you may have even forgotten about? Let's start a new story. There was this one Saturday morning a couple of years ago that still plays in my mind like a sitcom rerun. It started with the kind of ambition only caffeine can inspire. I decided to fix my leaky kitchen sink. Now, let me preface this by saying I am not a handy person. I'm the guy who once put together an IKEA chair so badly it became a wobbly stool. But that morning, I woke up and thought, why not me? I Googled DIY sink repair, skimmed the first article, and convinced myself I was Bob Vila in flannel pajamas. The leak was under the sink, so I grabbed a wrench, a bucket, and a smug sense of self-sufficiency. I got down on my hands and knees, wedged myself into the cabinet, and began tinkering. 10 minutes in, I was doing great. No leaks, no panique. I even started humming that Eye of the Tiger montage music in my head. Then I twisted the wrong nut, and whoosh, a pipe came loose, and water sprayed everywhere like I just punctured a fire hydrant. I flailed, lost my grip, and bonked my head on the inside of the cabinet. While I was lying there, soaking wet and seeing stars, my cat Oliver decided this was the moment to investigate. He peeked into the cabinet, looking thoroughly unimpressed, and then stepped on my stomach with the grace of a tiny, furry king. It's like he was saying, "This is why we hire professionals, Carl." By the time I got the water shut off, my kitchen floor looked like the set of Titanic, right after the iceberg. My socks squished as I shuffled around, and I just stood there, staring at the ceiling, trying to make peace with the fact that I had made things worse instead of better. That's when the doorbell rang. I opened it, dripping and defeated, to find my neighbor Linda holding a plate of muffins. Linda is this sweet, retired kindergarten teacher who somehow bakes better than most bakeries. She immediately gasped and said, "Oh, honey, what happened?" And before I could even explain, she handed me the muffins, rolled up her sleeves, and marched into my kitchen like she was storming Normandy. Linda has this no-nonsense way of handling things that reminds you how underwhelming your life skills are. She took one look under the sink and said, "You loosened the trap joint, didn't you?" I nodded, embarrassed, and she muttered something about these YouTube tutorials before expertly reattaching the pipe with a few twists of her wrist. It took her about 5 minutes to fix what I'd spent an hour ruining. When she was done, Linda sat me down at my kitchen table, poured me a glass of water from her reusable bottle, because of course Linda is better prepared than me in every conceivable way, and made me eat a muffin. As I chewed in silence, she said, "You know, Carl, the first time I baked muffins, they were so bad my dog wouldn't eat them. But I kept trying. You'll get there." I nodded like a chastened kid who just got caught trying to sneak cookies before dinner. She smiled, patted my hand, and left. Now, you might think the lesson here is about persistence, or maybe something like knowing your limits and calling a plumber. But honestly, what stuck with me most was the importance of having a Linda in your life. Someone who sees your disasters, doesn't judge you too harshly, and steps in with just the right mix of advice and muffins. Since that day, I've tried to be a little more Linda when my friends mess up, which, let's be real, happens a lot. I mean, not all of us can twist a wrench correctly on the first try. So now I'm curious. Have you ever had one of those random, unexpected moments that somehow turned into a life lesson? Whether it was a botched project, an embarrassing mishap, or just a wise neighbor showing up with baked goods, I'd love to hear your stories. What's your sink catastrophe, turned meaningful memory? Let's start a new story. I had just moved to a new city, and the neon lights seemed to call my name like they knew I needed to forget the past 6 months. Fresh heartbreak, a new job, and a sense of restless independence had me stepping into a bar I had never been to, ready to see what the night had to offer. The music was loud, the drinks were strong, and I was feeling invincible, or at least I wanted to. That's when I noticed him, the kind of guy who seemed like he was carved out of the night itself. Tall, easy smile, and eyes that locked onto mine with an intensity that was almost cinematic. I didn't plan for anything to happen, but I couldn't stop it either. We started talking, and every line he said made me laugh harder than the last. He wasn't trying too hard, just effortlessly charismatic. He noticed the tiniest things about me, like how I tapped my glass rhythmically to the beat of the music or how I tilted my head when I was really listening. Before I knew it, we were trading stories, then jokes, then secrets, like the world outside the bar had disappeared. At some point, we were on the dance floor. I don't even remember how we got there. The crowd pushed us closer together, the music pumping through every cell in my body. And then it happened. His lips met mine, and the rest of the world blurred into insignificance. It felt dangerous and thrilling, like I'd stepped into a movie. One thing led to another, as these stories often go. We left the bar laughing like we were the only two people who understood the punchline to a joke no one else had heard. His place wasn't far, and I followed him, adrenaline and curiosity guiding me more than logic or reason. When the door closed behind us, it was like entering another universe. Everything felt heightened. The way he touched me, the way he whispered my name like it was something sacred. The night was, to put it mildly, unforgettable. It wasn't just about the physicality of it. It was the way he made me feel seen, like I was the most exciting person in the room, even though it was just the two of us. We stayed up late, talking and laughing in between stolen kisses. At one point, I even forgot why I'd been so stressed earlier that day. But the morning came, as mornings do, and with it, the sobering reality of the sunlight streaming through the blinds. I woke up before he did and stared at the ceiling, the high of the night before fading into a quiet hum. That's when the questions started creeping in. What does this mean? Was this just a one-off? And why did I care so much about what it meant? He stirred awake and gave me a sleepy smile, and for a moment, it felt easy again. We chatted a bit, exchanged numbers, and promised to keep in touch, though the weight of that promise already felt flimsy. As I left his place, the air seemed colder than it had the night before, like the universe was subtly reminding me that magic hours don't last forever. Over the next few days, I kept replaying the night in my head. On one hand, I had zero regrets. It was fun, exciting, and exactly what I needed in the moment. On the other hand, I couldn't help but wonder if this was the kind of connection I really wanted. I told myself I was fine with casual, but part of me couldn't shake the thought that I was craving something more, a deeper connection, something that didn't dissolve with the sunrise. He texted once, a polite but vague, "Hey, hope you're doing well," message that didn't go anywhere. I didn't press. It wasn't hard to read between the lines. It had been a fleeting thing for him, and maybe that's all it was supposed to be. But it made me realize something about myself. For all the excitement of that night, I wasn't built for these kinds of encounters. Not in the long run. There's a thrill to losing yourself in someone for a night, but it also leaves you with this quiet emptiness afterward, like the aftermath of a sugar rush. It made me think about the balance between freedom and connection, and how I'd been chasing the former to avoid admitting how much I wanted the latter. That night wasn't a mistake, but it was a lesson, and one I needed to learn. Now, whenever I passed that bar, I smiled to myself, remembering the neon lights and the stranger who felt like a character from a dream. But I also remind myself that it's okay to want more than just a moment. It's okay to want the kind of magic that lasts beyond the night. Let's start a new story. I was on my usual bus ride home after a long, completely unremarkable day at work. The kind of day that just seems to exist in a blur. Meetings that lead nowhere, emails that feel like they're bouncing off the void, and the half-hearted promise to myself to cook something healthy tonight, knowing full well I'd end up with a microwave burrito. The bus itself was one of those clunky ones that feel like they belong in a 90s sitcom. Slightly too loud, slightly too crowded, with the faint smell of spilled coffee baked into the seats. I grabbed my usual spot by the window and plug in my headphones, not to listen to music but to discourage the chatty types. I wasn't in the mood for pleasantries. The bus rattled on, stopping every few blocks to let on a mix of tired commuters, students, and the occasional wild card, a term I use for the kind of people who make bus rides memorable, whether you want them to or not. It wasn't until we were halfway to my stop that she got on. She was an older woman, probably in her late 70s, dressed like she'd stepped straight out of a time capsule from the 1950s. Her coat was a rich teal, cinched at the waist, with a floral scarf tied under her chin in that effortlessly chic way you only see in vintage photos. She carried a small wicker basket, of all things, and when she sat down across from me, I noticed it was filled with lemons. Actual lemons. No grocery bags or context, just a basket of loose, bright yellow lemons. I try not to stare, but come on. It's not every day you see a person carrying a basket of lemons like their Little Red Riding Hood on a citrus-themed mission. As if sensing my curiosity, she looked directly at me, smiled, and said, "They're from my tree. I can't possibly eat them all." Her voice had a lilting, musical quality to it, like she was always on the verge of singing. Against my better judgment, I took out one headphone and replied, "You grow lemons? Around here?" It was a stupid question. We weren't in a climate where lemon trees thrive, but she nodded solemnly, as if I'd just asked the most profound thing. "Oh yes, it's a stubborn little tree, but it does its best. I think it likes proving people wrong." The conversation unfolded like a stream you don't realize is carrying you until you're in too deep to turn back. She told me about the lemon tree, how it had been her mother's, planted decades ago in a tiny backyard that shouldn't have had room for a tree at all. It had outlived storms, winters, and even the house itself, which had been sold years ago to someone who promised to keep the tree standing. "The roots know me," she said, her eyes twinkling. "And every year, it gives me just enough lemons to share." By now, the bus was less crowded, and I realized we were rapidly approaching my stop. But something about this woman made me hesitate to press the button. She must have noticed because she said, almost conspiratorially, "I'm heading to the park. Come with me. You should see where the lemons end up." I'd like to say I wrestled with the decision, but honestly, I was so intrigued that I just nodded and stayed seated. When we reached the park, she led me to a small, sunlit corner where a group of kids was playing. She knelt down with surprising grace for someone her age and began handing out lemons. "Go on," she urged them. "Feel how heavy they are, how cool they are in your hands." The kids took them like they were the rarest treasures, holding the lemons up to their noses, marveling at the scent. One little boy, no more than 6, declared, "This is the best lemon in the world," and the woman laughed, a full, bell-like laugh that made the air around us feel warmer. At some point, she turned to me and said, "You see, magic is simple. It's just sharing what you have and letting it be enough." I stood there, speechless, holding one of her lemons without realizing I'd taken it. The rind was smooth under my fingers, and for some inexplicable reason, I felt like I'd been entrusted with something sacred. Eventually, she stood, dusted off her hands, and said she had to catch another bus. Before I could stop myself, I asked her name. She smiled but didn't answer, just pointed at the lemon in my hand and said, "Now you're part of the tree too." And then she was gone, disappearing down the path like a character in a story who knows when to exit. I walked home, holding that lemon the way you'd cradle an heirloom. I didn't know what to do with it. Too special to cook with, too real to just keep on a shelf. So I planted the seeds. They didn't sprout, but I check the pot every now and then anyway, just in case. The lemon, though, it's long gone, but the smell of lemons hasn't quite left my memory. And every now and then, when I pass that park, I wonder if she's been back with her basket of gold. Have you ever felt like the world gave you a playful wink? A moment where life tugged you out of the ordinary just to say, "Hey, you're part of the magic too?" Let's start a new story. It started like any other gray Tuesday. I had overslept, spilling coffee on my favorite shirt while trying to catch a bus I ultimately missed. At work, my inbox was a mess, my boss was in a mood, and I was just trying to survive until lunchtime. But then, at precisely 12:07 p.m., I made a decision that changed everything. I walked past the deli I always went to and instead turned left, wandering aimlessly down a street I'd never really noticed before. Maybe it was the way the clouds broke apart just then, letting the sun spill over the sidewalk. Or maybe it was my subconscious nudging me towards something extraordinary. Either way, I just kept walking. About 3 blocks later, I noticed a little bookstore tucked between a laundromat and a closed-up boutique. Its window was painted with the words, "The Wandering Reader" in faded gold, and a small bell chimed as I pushed open the door. The air inside was thick with the scent of paper and cedarwood, like it had been locked in time for decades. Behind the counter was an older woman with round glasses and a knitted shawl. She smiled as if she had been expecting me. "Looking for something?" she asked, her voice warm and full of secrets. "Not really," I replied, but even as I said it, my eyes landed on a book sitting alone on a wooden pedestal in the center of the room. The cover was leather-bound and worn, with no title or author, just an embossed symbol I didn't recognize. "That one," I said, pointing, and the woman's smile widened. "Ah," she said, "the book chooses the reader. Take it." I opened my mouth to ask how much, but she waved me off. "It's yours. Trust me." It was odd, but her certainty left no room for argument. I slipped the book into my bag and thanked her, stepping back out into the sunlight feeling lighter, like I had just completed some sort of ancient ritual without fully understanding it. The rest of the day should have been normal, but it wasn't. The first strange thing happened about 20 minutes later when I realized I was starving and couldn't stop thinking about this little diner my dad used to take me to as a kid. It had closed years ago, but I suddenly felt this inexplicable urge to find it. I wandered the streets for what felt like an hour, letting instinct guide me, until there it was, except it wasn't closed. The sign above the door read Elliot's, just like it had all those years ago, and the smell of burgers and fries wafted out like a beacon. I stepped inside, half expecting to find a ghost, but everything was exactly as I remembered. I even sat at the same booth my dad and I used to sit at. The waitress brought me a vanilla milkshake without me even ordering, setting it down with a knowing smile. "It's been a while since we've seen you," she said like I was a regular. "Welcome back." I didn't correct her. I just drank the milkshake, marveling at how it tasted exactly like it had in my childhood memories. When I asked for the bill, the waitress shook her head. "It's on the house," she said. "Call it a welcome home gift." By now, the day was surreal, but it wasn't over. As I walked back to the bus stop, flipping through the strange book the woman had given me, a loose piece of paper fluttered out. It was a map, not a detailed one, more like an old hand-drawn sketch, with squiggly lines and landmarks marked by symbols. A tree, a bridge, a star. In the bottom corner, written in faint ink, were the words, "Find the star before sunset." It felt like a dare, and something about it called to me. So, I went. The map led me to a park I'd never visited before, to a path winding through a grove of oak trees that opened up to a small clearing. In the center stood a fountain that didn't seem like it should belong there. It was intricate and old, with moss creeping over its edges. Above it, hanging from the branches of the tallest tree, was a single silver star ornament glinting in the waning light. I don't know why, but I laughed when I saw it, a real, honest laugh that made me feel like a kid again. For a few minutes, I just stood there, watching the sunlight bounce off the star as the air around me buzzed with the hum of crickets and distant laughter. That's when I met her. She was sitting on a bench near the fountain, sketching in a little notebook. Her hair was braided with tiny flowers woven in, like she'd stepped out of some woodland fairy tale. "You found it," she said, glancing at the star and then back at me. Her voice was soft, but full of that same strange certainty the woman in the bookstore had. "I think so," I replied, holding up the map. "Did you draw this?" She smiled, tilting her head like she was considering how much to tell me. "Something like that." We talked until the sun set completely, the world around us growing quiet and still. She told me about how she came to the fountain almost every day to sketch, how she believed in the magic of ordinary places, and how she thought the star was a little piece of someone else's story she had stumbled into. I told her about the book and the diner, and how the whole day felt like a dream I didn't want to wake up from. "Maybe you're living the story now," she said. When it was finally time to leave, she tore a page from her sketchbook and handed it to me, a drawing of the fountain with the star hanging above it. On the back, she'd written her name and number. I never saw the bookstore again. I went back the next day, eager to tell the old woman everything. But the space was empty, the windows boarded up as if it had been that way for years. The book was gone too. I couldn't find it anywhere in my apartment, though I swore I had left it on my nightstand. It felt like the universe had conspired to give me one perfect day, then whisked away all the clues to prove it had ever happened. I still have the sketch though, and sometimes when the sky is just the right shade of gold, I think about how a single decision to take a different route turned a regular Tuesday into something magical. Have you ever had a day that felt like it was straight out of a storybook or an old movie? Let's start a new story. It's been one of those nights where the scroll hits too close to home. I'm lying in bed, thumbing through endless takes on things people think should be banned. Some are funny, some are just infuriating, but the one about squatting law sticks with me. It reminds me of the time I came back from my own 2-week getaway, only to find my world flipped upside down. Picture this. I'd been in Santorini, soaking up sunsets and tzatziki, letting all the stress from my job melt away into the Aegean Sea. I'd even gone a little overboard on the souvenirs. Tiny ceramic donkeys and bottles of ouzo packed neatly into my carry-on. As my cab pulled up to my quiet little house back home, I was mentally preparing to re-enter normal life. But something was off. There was a different car in the driveway, an old sedan that looked like it had seen more road trips than oil changes. My porch light was on, odd considering I'd turned everything off before leaving. The real gut punch came when I tried my key. It didn't work. I stared at the lock, as if my disbelief might magically undo whatever had happened. My heart was pounding in that surreal, slow-motion way when your brain's still catching up to reality. I knocked, hesitantly at first, then harder when no one answered. Curtains twitched, and a woman opened the door, middle-aged, dressed in a frumpy sweatshirt, with a look that screamed both confusion and defiance. "Can I help you?" she asked, as if I were the trespasser. I explained, still polite, still trying to cling to the hope that this was just a misunderstanding. "This is my house," I said, trying to keep the rising panic out of my voice. "No, it's not," she shot back. "We got the paperwork." And she did. She brandished some official-looking document I didn't even bother to read. It was like a scene out of a bad daytime TV drama. The cops showed up an hour later. It was late, I was jet-lagged, and I thought surely they'd straighten it all out. But here's the kicker, they couldn't. That woman and her husband, who had appeared by then with a smug grin and a cup of coffee, claimed they'd rented the place fair and square from some landlord I'd never heard of. They flashed their paperwork again, and the officers shrugged like their hands were tied. Apparently, proving ownership wasn't something that could be done on the spot. I was stunned. My name was on the deed. My photos, my mail, my life. Everything about this place screamed it was mine. But none of that mattered in the moment. "We'll need to let the courts sort this out," one of the officers said, as if that was supposed to comfort me. Meanwhile, the squatters got to stay in my house, sleep in my bed, use my shower. I had to crash at a friend's place, seething and helpless, until things could be straightened out. By the time I regained control of my home, weeks later, they'd trashed the place. Holes in the walls, garbage everywhere, a busted-up washing machine. They'd even taken some of my stuff. It cost me thousands to repair, not to mention the emotional toll. That's when I learned the hard way about the infuriating gray area of squatting laws. It's this twisted system where the actual homeowner gets treated like a suspect while the trespassers get the benefit of the doubt. The whole ordeal left me wondering why on earth there wasn't a better way to handle these situations. If cops can run your license plate in seconds, why can't they verify a property deed just as fast? Why is the system so quick to protect people abusing the law while leaving the real victims in limbo? So yeah, when I read about squatting laws in that thread, it hit me like a sucker punch. It's not just a story, it's a waking nightmare, one that haunts you long after you've changed the locks and patched up the drywall. If there's one thing I'd fight to see banned, it's the way our legal system seems to side with the wrong people far too often. Let's start a new story. There I was, standing in the dim light of my cluttered attic, surrounded by cardboard boxes stacked so precariously that they felt more like time bombs than time capsules. It wasn't even a deliberate trip down memory lane. I was hunting for something mundane, an old extension cord, maybe, or a box of Christmas ornaments my partner had asked me to bring down. But fate had other plans. My hand grazed the corner of a box marked MISC, written in my mom's loopy handwriting, faded and smudged with age. The tape had gone brittle and yellow, like it had been holding on for dear life all these years, just waiting for someone to pull it apart. Inside, beneath layers of crumpled newspaper, there it was, a VHS tape, its label slightly peeling. Written in blocky black marker, it simply read, Summer '97. I didn't even have a VCR anymore. Who does? But holding that tape, a floodgate opened in my mind. I could almost feel the dry, scratchy grass beneath my legs from that summer. The way the world smelled different back then, full of cut grass and sun-baked pavement. I could hear the distant hum of cicadas, the faint clinking of ice cubes in a neighbor's lemonade. The tape felt cool in my hand, the grooves of the plastic textured just enough to make me close my eyes and wonder if the last person who held it was me, some version of me, so different from the one standing there now. That summer, I'd spent hours lugging around my dad's bulky camcorder, trying to be Spielberg with zero budget and less talent. My cousins and I shot terrible home movies, filled with shaky zoom-ins, out-of-focus close-ups, and whispered stage directions. We thought we were geniuses, the kind of invincible, unshakable confidence you only get to borrow for a few years and childhood hummed in every frame. I remembered how we'd all scrambled to be the first to watch playback on that tiny, flickering camcorder screen, crouched together so close that our sweaty arms stuck to one another. In my hands, that tape wasn't just plastic, it was a key to that world. And for a second, I almost forgot the attic's stale smell and the insulation itching in my skin. I couldn't let it go. I tucked the tape under my arm and went downstairs, where my partner raised an eyebrow at the treasure I had unearthed. "Do we even own anything that plays those?" they asked, half laughing. I shook my head, but didn't answer. It didn't matter if I could watch it or not. Just holding it was enough to feel like I'd unearthed a lost part of myself. But the strangest thing happened later that evening. I left the tape on the kitchen counter and forgot about it for a while. Dinner, dishes, the usual evening routine blurred into each other until the house was quiet again. And then, while scrolling aimlessly on my phone, I heard it, the muffled sound of the ice cream truck outside. It was long past the time of day you'd expect to hear that cheerful little jingle, and it didn't even sound quite right. Wobbly and slowed down, like a ghostly echo of the trucks that used to pass by our neighborhood. My heart stuttered. I hadn't heard that song in years, maybe decades. I bolted up and ran to the window, laughing at myself for being ridiculous, and watched the truck slowly trundle down the street. The driver wasn't stopping for customers. Maybe they were testing the speakers or just taking a nostalgic joyride themselves. But it didn't matter. That strange little soundscape transported me straight back to sticky fingers holding orange creamsicles, to coins clinking in my mom's hand as she handed me my allowance, to racing barefoot on hot asphalt as I shouted for the truck to stop. It's funny how your brain stitches these moments together, like it's been quietly collecting souvenirs for you while you weren't paying attention. The VHS tape, the ice cream truck, even the smell of the attic. It all felt like puzzle pieces slotting into place. Each one revealed a part of me I didn't know I had missed. It wasn't sadness exactly, but something softer and harder to pin down. A longing, maybe a quiet gratitude for the small things that made growing up feel like magic. I haven't had a chance to watch the tape yet. I'm still on the hunt for a working VCR. But just knowing it's there, waiting, is enough for now. It feels like a secret I've uncovered, a reminder that pieces of who we were don't really disappear. They just hide in boxes, waiting for us to find them again. And who knows? Maybe one day I'll press play and remember not just the moments I filmed, but the kid I was crouching behind that camcorder dreaming big. What about you? What small, randomly found things bring you a moment of calm nostalgia? Let's start a new story. I woke up this morning to the smell of coffee. Nothing unusual, except for the faint hum of words floating down the hallway, like a melody in a language I somehow understood without hearing. I rubbed my eyes, wandered toward the kitchen, and there it was. My coffee pot, a sleek stainless steel machine I'd bought on sale last Black Friday, was humming softly to itself. When it noticed me, it perked up, pun entirely intended, and said, "Finally, someone to appreciate my art. You wouldn't believe the effort it takes to brew the perfect cup. Go ahead, taste it." I blinked. You can talk?" "Obviously," it replied with a sniff. "And I'd appreciate it if you'd stop leaving me on for hours. A masterpiece like this deserves to be sipped fresh." Before I could even respond, a dramatic sigh came from the counter. My toaster, an aging 4-slice model with a chip in its handle, chimed in. "Oh, please, you're not the only appliance in this kitchen, you know. I brown bread to perfection every morning, and all I get is crumbs. Literally crumbs. Because that's your job," the coffee pot shot back, sounding offended. "Your toast, darling. Basic." I was too stunned to interject, standing there in my pajamas while my appliances bickered. Then the fridge butted in. "Would both of you just chill?" it rumbled. "She looks freaked out enough as it is." It took me a solid 10 minutes to accept what was happening. Everything in my house had come to life. Or rather, it had apparently always been alive and just chose today to reveal itself. My blender, my lamp, even the lone sock at the bottom of my laundry basket. It apologized for disappearing. "I just needed some alone time, okay? Life's overwhelming when you're always paired up." Once the initial shock wore off, I started to have fun with it. My vacuum cleaner gushed about how much it loved carpets, but hated hardwood floors. So many tiny crumbs. It's exhausting. My wardrobe gave unsolicited fashion advice as I got dressed, recommending a scarf I'd forgotten I owned. "Trust me, this'll pull the outfit together. You'll thank me later." By lunchtime, my couch had convinced me to rearrange the living room. Seriously, I'd feel so much better if you just angled me toward the window. Let me soak up some sun, you know? Being a couch is more fulfilling when you're part of the ambience. Even my bathroom mirror had opinions. "You really should exfoliate more," it said as I brushed my teeth. "No offense, just looking out for you." "Oh, and stop making faces at yourself when you floss." It's weird. It was like living in a sitcom. My kettle was an amateur philosopher, pondering the meaning of boiling water. Do I transform it, or does it transform me? My bookshelf complained about the uneven weight distribution of its novels. You've got Tolstoy and a paperback romance crammed on the same shelf. I'm going to collapse under the existential pressure. I even struck up a friendship with my bedside lamp. She had a soothing voice, the kind that makes you feel like everything's going to be okay, and she loved to gossip about my phone. It's always buzzing. Do you know how distracting that is when I'm trying to light up your nighttime reading? The strangest part wasn't the talking objects, though. It was how natural it all felt. Like this was how life was always supposed to be, surrounded by opinionated, occasionally sassy companions who genuinely wanted to help. My house came alive, quite literally, and I couldn't stop grinning. By the time evening rolled around, my coffee pot had brewed decaf for me. You've had enough caffeine today, trust me. And my TV offered up a carefully curated movie suggestion. I know you've been rewatching rom-coms, but how about a classic tonight? Casablanca, maybe? It's timeless. I cuddled up under a blanket that purred softly against my skin. Finally, some quality time, and watched the movie, laughing at the absurdity of my day. It wasn't just delightful. It was deeply comforting, like my home had always been this alive, and I'd just been too busy to notice. As I drifted off to sleep, my pillow whispered, "Sweet dreams. I'll fluff myself up for you while you sleep." And I knew I'd wake up tomorrow ready to hear what the toaster had to say about breakfast. So now I'm wondering, have you ever imagined something as crazy and fun as this? If not, what wild, delightful scenario would you want to wake up to? Let's start a new story. It started on one of those sticky summer nights when the air felt heavy, like it had a story to tell. We were at his place, sprawled on his couch, our favorite crime show playing in the background while we pretended to care about the plot. Nick, my best friend of 8 years, had a knack for making me laugh even on my worst days. That night, he made some stupid joke about how we were both unwanted misfits who die single and adopt 3 cats each. It was so absurdly tragic that I laughed so hard I snorted. He grinned at me with that mischievous glint in his eye, and before I could think twice, I threw a pillow at him. The pillow fight escalated. His couch was too small for both of us, so we ended up tangled on the floor, both gasping for air. There was a moment when I looked up and saw him staring at me, really staring. It wasn't like the way he usually teased me, or the way he looked at strangers. This was deeper, quieter. I was about to make a joke, break the tension like we always did, but he brushed a strand of hair from my face and whispered, "You're beautiful." Nick wasn't the type to say things like that. He was sarcastic and self-deprecating, always deflecting. That's why his words hit like a freight train. I felt my heart skip, my stomach knot, but instead of pulling away, I leaned in. It was just a kiss, soft at first, tentative, then it wasn't. It became something raw and consuming, a collision of years of unspoken tension. When it was over, we were both stunned. The show was still playing in the background, some detective shouting about a missing weapon. It felt surreal. We didn't talk about it immediately. He got up, fetched 2 beers from the fridge, and handed me one like nothing had happened. I wanted to laugh at how ridiculous it all was, but instead, I drank in silence, stealing glances at him, trying to read his mind. The next few days were a blur of confusion. We kept texting like normal, memes, dumb updates about our day, but the subtext was suffocating. Then came the night when everything spiraled. We were at a friend's party, and I caught Nick talking to this girl with fiery red hair and a laugh that turned heads. I told myself I didn't care. I had no right to. But the ache in my chest told a different story. I drank more than I should have, trying to drown the jealousy that wasn't mine to feel. Later, when the party wound down, he found me sitting on the porch steps. Without a word, he sat beside me, our shoulders brushing. "You've been weird lately," he said, breaking the silence. I scoffed, trying to play it cool, but he wasn't buying it. "Is this about the kiss?" I wanted to lie, laugh it off, but the way he looked at me made it impossible. "I don't know what this is," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Nick let out a long sigh, his hands raking through his messy hair. "Neither do I, but I know I don't want to lose you." We agreed to figure it out, whatever that meant. For weeks, we danced around each other, oscillating between best friends and something more. Some days it felt natural, easy. Other days, the weight of it all made me want to scream. The first time we slept together, it wasn't planned. We were watching an old rom-com, mocking the cheesy dialogue when he kissed me again. One thing led to another, and suddenly, we were lying in his bed, our breaths mingling in the dark. It was messy and imperfect, but it felt right in a way I couldn't explain. The morning after, we joked about it, pretending it was no big deal. But deep down, we both knew everything had changed. For a while, it was amazing. We fell into this rhythm of secret kisses, late-night confessions, and shared mornings that felt like stolen treasures. But cracks began to show. I started overanalyzing everything. His texts, his silences, the way he talked to other girls. He wasn't mine. Not really, and that realization gnawed at me. The turning point came on a rainy Tuesday. We had planned to meet for coffee, but he showed up late, distracted. He mentioned a girl from work, how she'd invited him to some event, and I felt my stomach drop. "So, are we just going to ignore what's happening between us?" I blurted out. Nick froze, his coffee cup halfway to his lips. "I thought we were keeping it casual," he said, his tone cautious. Casual. The word felt like a slap. I realized then that while I was falling for him, he was still holding back, too scared or unsure to dive in. We argued, voices low but sharp, the cafe around us a blur of strangers. I told him I couldn't keep doing this, couldn't keep pretending it didn't hurt. He looked at me with those same deep eyes, and for a moment, I thought he'd fight for us. But he didn't. He just nodded, his face unreadable. We didn't talk for weeks after that. The silence was unbearable, but I convinced myself it was for the best. Then, one night, he showed up at my door, drenched from the rain, his expression torn between regret and hope. "I miss you," he said, his voice cracking. I wanted to be angry, to slam the door and tell him it was too late. But the truth was I missed him too, more than I cared to admit. We spent hours talking, unraveling the mess we'd made. He admitted he was scared of losing me, of ruining the one good thing he had. I told him I needed more than half measures and mixed signals. It wasn't an instant fix. We had to rebuild, redefine what we meant to each other. Some days, it felt impossible, like we were walking a tightrope with no safety net. But we kept trying, because at the heart of it all, beneath the layers of confusion and fear, was something worth fighting for. Something real. Let's start a new story. It started with a banana peel. Not in the metaphorical, life is slippery sense, but a literal banana peel sitting on the edge of the trash can in my office break room. I noticed it there as I walked in to grab my lunch, a leftover burrito I'd been looking forward to all morning, and I immediately felt a pang of irritation. It wasn't even a particularly big trash can, and whoever had left it there clearly decided close enough was good enough. I remember muttering under my breath, something unkind about humanity's inability to follow basic rules, as I tossed my burrito into the microwave. As the microwave hummed and rotated my future happiness in awkward, lumpy circles, I stared at that peel, deciding if it was worth fixing. My inner monologue was full of righteous indignation. If I pick it up, I'm enabling them. But also, who am I to just walk away from this madness? And then, in a moment of what I thought was moral courage, I picked it up and threw it into the trash where it belonged. As I turned around feeling smug about my small contribution to office civility, I saw Karen from accounting watching me with an amused expression. "Good for you," she said with a smirk, and I was instantly deflated. Somehow, Karen's tone made me feel ridiculous for caring at all. Who was I kidding? This wasn't a grand gesture. It was a banana peel. My burrito dinged, and I grabbed it, determined to forget the whole thing. Later that afternoon, I was in the middle of my usual post-lunch slump, sipping on the sad remnants of my morning coffee, when I overheard a conversation near the break room. Karen was laughing and telling someone about the banana peel hero and how someone finally had enough of our garbage rebellion. There was a lot of laughter, and I had that sinking, self-conscious feeling that only comes from realizing you've accidentally become the butt of a joke. Great. My moral high ground had turned into a banana-scented meme. But then it got weirder. Over the next few days, I started noticing things. Little things. The trash in the break room was suddenly neater. People were stacking their dishes in the sink instead of leaving them scattered like a crime scene. Someone even put up a little sign above the trash can, "Aim for greatness." It was written in Comic Sans, but still, the sentiment was there. The strangest part was how much it bothered me. I wanted to believe that my banana peel moment hadn't sparked some sort of office cleanliness revolution. Surely not. That would make me what? An accidental leader? A vigilante of tidiness? No, this had to be coincidental. But the more I tried to convince myself it was all random, the more I noticed people glancing my way as they tidied up or muttering something about doing their part. And that's how I found myself in a spiral of existential reflection over a forgotten piece of fruit. I started thinking about the little moments in life when we act on impulse, completely unaware that anyone else is paying attention. Like when you hold the door open for someone and they're 10 feet away, but they speed up, so you both end up in this weird race of politeness. Or when you let someone merge in front of you during traffic, and they wave like you've just saved their family from certain doom. I mean, most of the time, we're just going through the motions, right? Doing what feels right without expecting much in return. But what if those tiny moments actually matter? Weeks passed, and the trash can saga became an inside joke at the office. People started leaving random notes on the trash can like you're the real MVP or trash responsibly. Someone even started a tally of how many times it got emptied in a week. I found myself oddly proud of the weird little culture we'd created around something so mundane. It wasn't just about the trash anymore. It was about noticing each other, laughing together, and finding meaning in the everyday mess. One day, as I was leaving work, Karen caught me by the elevator. She handed me a banana, no explanation, just a smug little smile, and I burst out laughing. For a moment, I considered explaining that I hadn't meant to spark all this, that it wasn't some grand statement. But then I realized it didn't matter. Sometimes life hands you a banana peel, and what you do with it might not change the world, but it might change your corner of it. So, do you ever find yourself in a moment like that? One where something small, even ridiculous, takes on a life of its own and suddenly feels like a sign from the universe, or at least a really funny coincidence. Let's start a new story. I was cleaning out my closet last weekend, trying to be productive on a rainy afternoon, when I found it. Tucked away in a forgotten corner, between a stack of yellowing college notebooks and an old shoebox, was a tiny bottle of vanilla body spray. You know the type. Cheap, overly sweet, probably something I picked up in high school because it felt grown-up, but not too grown-up. I unscrewed the cap almost on instinct, and before I even realized what I was doing, I gave it a cautious spritz. The smell hit me like a lightning bolt wrapped in warm, sugary clouds. My closet disappeared. My apartment disappeared. I was standing in the hallway of my old high school, slouching against the scuffed-up lockers with a pack of gum in my back pocket and my entire future in front of me. I could practically hear the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant echo of sneakers squeaking on polished gym floors. The body spray wasn't just a scent, it was a time machine. For a moment, I was 14 again in my best friend's room. We were supposed to be working on a history project, but we'd abandoned that hours ago to sit cross-legged on her bed, flipping through magazines and swiping her mom's eyeliner like we were makeup pros. She had the same vanilla spray, and she'd spritz it over her head like some kind of perfume rain cloud, announcing that this was her signature scent. We'd laugh until our sides hurt, choking on the sweetness and teasing her for smelling like a cookie. The weirdest part was how the smell wasn't just a smell. It had weight, texture, a warmth that sank into my skin and brought with it the way the world felt back then. When summer meant freedom and crushes were so intense they were almost painful, and everything you wore to school could be the difference between fitting in and total humiliation. That stupid bottle of body spray carried all of it, like a secret waiting to be uncapped. I couldn't stop sniffing it, which I realize sounds ridiculous, but it was like I had stumbled onto the exact shade of sunlight that used to pour through my bedroom window on lazy Saturday mornings. Back when I'd wake up to the smell of pancakes and coffee from the kitchen and the faint hiss of my dad flipping through the newspaper. Back when the biggest decision of the day was which pair of sneakers to wear to the mall with my friends. The more I smelled it, the more memories started to stack on top of each other, until it was almost overwhelming. There was the glitter lip gloss I used to keep in my pencil case, the ridiculous friendship bracelets we'd knot together with embroidery floss, and wear until they fell off in frayed, soggy tangles. Even the crumpled up notes we'd pass in class, folded into elaborate triangles that took an engineering degree to open. Each little thing came back so vividly, it was like I could reach out and touch them. And oh, the music. For some reason, the smell made me think of the songs we used to belt out in the car, the kind of music you'd play too loud, windows down, hoping anyone would notice how cool you were. I could almost hear the tinny, overworked speakers of my old CD player, crackling with static as we screamed along to Avril Lavigne or Green Day, feeling so misunderstood and so sure no one in the world had ever felt what we felt. It was such a simple moment, standing there in my cluttered closet with that bottle of body spray in my hand, but it made me realize how much we leave behind without meaning to. Not the big, important stuff, but the tiny, almost invisible things that make us who we are. The way the rubbery smell of a brand new kickball can summon the sound of recess bells. The way the cold slickness of an ice pop wrapper brings back sticky summer afternoons. The way a song can drop you right back into a memory you didn't even know you still had. For the rest of the day, I felt lighter, like I'd rediscovered a part of myself I hadn't seen in years. It wasn't just nostalgia. It was like reconnecting with an old friend, someone who knew me before life got so complicated. I'm sure that bottle of spray will probably give me a headache if I use it too much, but I'll keep it, just for those moments when I need to remember what it felt like to be young and wide-eyed and endlessly hopeful. So now I'm curious, what little things bring you back to moments that always warm your heart? Let's start a new story. Sometimes I catch myself marveling at how effortlessly absurd life has become in the best possible way. Like the other day, I realized I haven't sent a single serious text message in weeks. Not one. Every single interaction on my phone has been a carousel of memes, emojis, and GIFs, like we all silently agreed to communicate solely through inside jokes and short-form absurdity. Someone sends a photo of a raccoon holding a tiny coffee cup, and instead of responding with words, I reply with an animated seal clapping. This, apparently, is how I convey both solidarity and mild amusement now. It's not that I don't care about these conversations. On the contrary, they feel almost intimate. The shared laughter, the unspoken understanding of exactly why a penguin falling on its face perfectly captures the chaos of Monday morning. It's weirdly wholesome. And then there's online shopping. Last week, I bought a single pen online. A pen. One. I stared at the checkout page for longer than I'd like to admit, wondering if I should feel guilty about the fact that someone somewhere was going to box up a solitary pen, probably with way too much packaging, and ship it to my door. But did that stop me? Of course not. 2 days later, I found myself eagerly opening a disproportionately large cardboard box to retrieve my prize. The absurdity hit me halfway through the unboxing process, but by then, I was too far gone. I'd already started admiring the pen, like it was a trophy, and not a $2 clicky thing I could have picked up at literally any gas station. I guess convenience has a way of making even the tiniest indulgences feel monumental. Speaking of indulgences, can we talk about food delivery? I used to think the idea of getting groceries delivered was the height of laziness. Now, I've fully embraced a reality where I can scroll through my phone at 11 p.m., click a few buttons, and have someone bring me a single tub of ice cream and a bottle of seltzer. It's like I'm living in some kind of dystopian utopia where my cravings are catered to with borderline alarming efficiency. The delivery person always gives me this look like, really, this is all you needed? And I have to resist the urge to explain that yes, this exact combination of items is essential to my survival in this moment. It's not just about the conveniences, though. It's the little quirks that creep into our lives so subtly we don't even question them anymore. Like how my morning routine now involves checking 3 different weather apps, not because I don't trust the first one, but because I want a second and third opinion. Or how I reflexively Google the most trivial questions as if the entire sum of human knowledge is just sitting there, waiting for me to wonder how long penguins live or whether plants can get sunburned. Spoiler, they can there's something oddly satisfying about having answers at your fingertips, even if those answers often lead you down a rabbit hole of tangentially related facts that you'll forget by tomorrow. And then there's the sheer volume of notifications we've all quietly accepted as normal. I get updates for everything now. Packages in transit, flash sales on websites I visited once 5 years ago, a reminder from an app to drink water, because apparently I can't be trusted to remember basic human functions. At least half of them are completely irrelevant, but there's a strange comfort in the constant pings and vibrations, like my phone is alive and trying to keep me company. Sometimes I'll hear a phantom buzz and instinctively check my pocket, only to realize it was my imagination. It's like my brain has rewired itself to crave the tiny dopamine hit of seeing a new notification, even if it's just an email from a brand I don't remember subscribing to. Even social media has become this bizarre blend of chaos and connection. 1 minute I'm watching a stranger's dog learn how to swim, and the next I'm scrolling through a heated debate about whether pineapple belongs on pizza. Somehow, it all feels equally significant. I'll find myself deeply invested in a TikTok about how to fold a fitted sheet, only to immediately forget everything I learned as soon as the video ends. But that's the beauty of it, I think. The fleeting joy of discovering something new, however trivial, and sharing it with a world that's just as eager to embrace the ridiculousness. What fascinates me most is how all these little things have quietly woven themselves into the fabric of everyday life. They're not monumental changes, but they add up to something larger, something that feels distinctly modern. Like the way we all instinctively know how to pose for a selfie now, tilting our heads at just the right angle or finding the perfect lighting. Or how we've developed an unspoken etiquette for video calls, like pretending not to notice when someone's Wi-Fi lags or their cat walks across the screen. It's funny how quickly we adapt to these things, how they become second nature without us even realizing it. And yet, for all the irony and absurdity, I can't help but find it all kind of delightful. Sure, it's ridiculous that I can't go a day without quoting a meme or Googling some random fact, but it's also a reminder of how adaptable and endlessly curious we are as a species. We've turned the mundane into something playful, the ordinary into something worth sharing. Maybe that's why I can't help but smile when I think about it. Because even in the strangest, most unexpected ways, these little quirks bring a sense of joy and connection to our lives. So, what about you? What little thing in today's world makes you smile, even if it's a bit quirky? Let's start a new story. When I first met Jason, I was convinced he was the most boring human being alive. I don't mean a little boring. I mean soul-crushingly dull. It was a sunny Friday afternoon, and I just started a new job, so my manager decided to introduce me to the team by dragging me to an office happy hour. I should have been excited about free drinks and new people, but I was already skeptical of the whole concept of forced fun. Then in walks Jason, wearing a button-up shirt so aggressively beige it looked like he'd stolen it from a 1970s accountant. He introduced himself by shaking my hand, like a real handshake, firm and formal, with no hint of a smile. Who shakes hands at a bar? I immediately pegged him as the office stick in the mud, the guy who files his taxes in January just for fun. He asked me where I was from, and when I answered, he said, yes, I've read about that area. Not been to that area, mind you. Read about it. I laughed nervously, unsure if he was joking. He wasn't. I filed him away in my mental cabinet of people to avoid unless absolutely necessary. But then life happened. Turns out, Jason sat directly across from me in our open plan office, and avoiding him was physically impossible unless I started working in the supply closet. He'd pop up over the cubicle divider like a meerkat, saying things like, "Do you know the history of Post-it notes?" Or "There's a surprising amount of engineering involved in stapler design." I would nod politely and shove my earbuds in before he could dive into another unsolicited TED Talk. My co-worker Emily even whispered to me one day, "You're so lucky you're the new target." He used to tell me about the weather patterns of random cities. One day, though, something shifted. It was after one of our infamous office potlucks, where everyone pretends their casserole didn't come from Costco. I'd baked a truly disastrous batch of cookies that turned out flatter than pancakes and hard as hockey pucks. Jason picked one up, studied it like he was in a forensic lab, and then took a dramatic bite. He said after a long pause. "It has texture, a certain architectural integrity." His deadpan delivery caught me completely off guard, and I burst out laughing. It was the first time I'd seen him crack a joke, even if it was at my expense. From then on, I started noticing little things about Jason, like how he'd sneak sticky notes with bad puns onto people's monitors when they weren't looking, or how he always noticed when someone was having a tough day and would quietly leave a mug of coffee on their desk with exactly the right amount of cream and sugar. He once spent his entire lunch break helping me untangle a ridiculously complicated Excel spreadsheet, even though I hadn't asked. And he didn't even make me feel stupid about it, which is its own kind of talent. The real turning point, though, came during the annual office trivia night. I almost didn't go because I'd assumed it would be unbearably awkward. But Jason was team captain, and somehow his enthusiasm was so endearing that I couldn't say no. He showed up wearing a homemade Trivia King sash, complete with glitter and little plastic crowns glued to it. I couldn't believe it. Mr. Beige's shirt had a crafty side. Throughout the night, he was a whirlwind of obscure facts and goofy banter. He gave out pep talks to the team like we were competing in the Olympics, and by the end of the night, we were all crying laughing over his dramatic reenactment of Titanic, which was somehow relevant to a question about shipwrecks. After trivia, he walked me to my car, and for the first time, we had a real conversation. No staplers, no post-it notes, just us. He told me about his childhood, how he used to be painfully shy and got through it by memorizing random facts as a way to connect with people. "It worked too well, I guess," he said, laughing. "Now I'm the human version of Wikipedia, and it's hard to turn off." I told him it wasn't a bad thing, and I meant it. The way he lit up when he talked about something he cared about, it was kind of amazing. The next day, he brought me a coffee with a sticky note that said, "For the reigning trivia queen." A month later, we went on our first date, where he told me all about the history of sushi while we ate it. And now, 2 years later, I still can't believe I thought he was boring. He's hilarious, thoughtful, and yeah, maybe he knows too much about staplers, but somehow that's become one of the things I love most about him. Have you ever been totally wrong about someone at first? Let's start a new story. It started as one of those days where the most exciting thing I anticipated was the click of the kettle boiling. The plan was to enjoy a lazy Sunday, catch up on a show, maybe read a chapter of that book I'd been pretending to love, and absolutely nothing that required shoes. But by mid-afternoon, I started to feel that familiar itch, the one that whispers, "You're wasting the day. Get up, go out, do something." I decided on a short walk to the park nearby, armed with a coffee and a sense of mild obligation to nature. The weather was crisp and cool, the kind of late autumn day where the trees hold onto their last brave leaves and the air smells faintly of fireplaces. I wasn't out to make memories, I just wanted to stretch my legs. At least that's what I thought. About 10 minutes into the walk, I noticed a side street I'd somehow never paid attention to. It wasn't remarkable, just a narrow lane lined with old brick buildings. But something about it felt inviting. Maybe it was the light, the way the late afternoon sun spilled golden over the cobblestones. Or maybe it was the faint sound of music that seemed to drift from somewhere further down. I hesitated, glancing at my watch. The park could wait. I turned down the street. The sound grew clearer as I walked. A violin, soft but lively, weaving a melody that seemed older than time itself. It led me to a tiny courtyard tucked between the buildings, where a group of people sat on mismatched chairs and benches. At the center was a woman, probably in her 60s, playing the violin as if her life depended on it. Her eyes were closed, her face serene yet intense, and her fingers moved like they were conjuring something out of the air. Around her, the crowd was small but enchanted. Couples holding hands, kids sitting cross-legged on the ground, an elderly man nodding his head to the rhythm. No one spoke, and no one looked like they wanted to. I didn't know what this was, but I was hooked. I found a spot against the wall and stood there, letting the music wash over me. It felt like I'd stumbled into a pocket of magic that had been there all along, waiting for someone to find it. When the song ended, everyone clapped softly, as if afraid to break the spell. The woman smiled, bowed slightly, and said, "Thank you for listening. The next one is special. It's a story of a lost bird finding its way home." She began to play again, and I swear I could feel the story in the notes, the way they dipped and soared like wings beating against the wind. At some point, a man sitting near me leaned over and whispered, "First time here?" I nodded, and he grinned. "She plays every Sunday. Found this place myself last year. It's like stumbling into a dream, right?" Before I could reply, a gust of wind rushed through the courtyard, carrying the music with it and rustling the leaves overhead. The man chuckled. "See? Even the weather knows it's special." When the performance ended, people lingered, chatting in soft tones like old friends reunited. The man who'd spoken to me introduced himself as Caleb, and before I knew it, I was talking with him and a few others about the music, the city, and life in general. Someone passed around a thermos of hot cider. Another person shared cookies wrapped in a cloth napkin. It felt like the kind of community I didn't know existed outside of movies. "Walk with us," Caleb said when the group began to disperse. "There's this bakery a few blocks down that makes these ridiculous pistachio croissants. If we hurry, they might still have a few." I didn't hesitate. The next hour blurred into a montage of laughter, warm pastries, and stories swapped like secrets. Caleb told us about the time he accidentally joined a wedding party in Spain. Someone else, a woman named Lena, shared how she once rescued a stray cat that turned out to belong to a local celebrity. Each tale seemed more whimsical than the last, as if the courtyard had cast some kind of spell on all of us. By the time we parted ways, the sun had set, and the city was bathed in that soft, dusky glow that makes everything feel poetic. I walked home with a pistachio croissant in one hand and a piece of paper in the other. Caleb's number scrawled next to the words, "Same time next week." I never made it to the park that day, but I found something better. A hidden corner of the world where strangers could feel like family, where music could tell stories, and where a simple walk could turn into something extraordinary. I still go back to that courtyard every Sunday, and each time, it feels like stepping into a secret that only a lucky few get to share. Have you ever had a regular day suddenly turn into an unforgettable adventure? Let's start a new story. It was the summer before senior year, and we thought we were untouchable. A group of us had spent weeks plotting what we believed would go down as the greatest prank in the history of Greenview High. Senior pranks weren't just a tradition, they were a rite of passage. The previous class had dyed the principal's pool neon green. The year before that, someone filled the entire teacher's lounge with helium balloons. But we wanted to top them all. Our idea? We'd turn the school's pristine front lawn into a giant, chaotic water park. It was absurd, ambitious, and, most importantly, utterly hilarious. The plan had moving parts. Jake, whose cousin worked at a party rental company, managed to score us a massive, inflatable water slide for the night. It was neon orange and at least 2 stories tall. Hardly inconspicuous, but perfect for our scheme. Meanwhile, Chris borrowed his dad's industrial-grade sprinklers, the kind you use to keep golf courses green during droughts. Mia and I took charge of procuring an ungodly amount of dish soap and food dye. We spent a ridiculous amount of time debating whether we wanted to create a cheerful pastel lagoon or go for something nightmarishly murky. Chaos won out. We chose a deep, swampy green. The hardest part was figuring out how to pull it off without getting caught. Greenview High wasn't exactly Fort Knox, but the janitor, old Mr. Milner, was infamous for his unpredictable patrols. However, legend had it he was a creature of habit, likely to be found in his office after midnight, sipping Diet Coke and blasting Journey on his ancient Walkman. Timing was crucial. We'd have exactly a 3-hour window between his rounds to set up our masterpiece. We assembled at 1 a.m., armed to the teeth with hoses, soap, sprinklers, and the inflatable monstrosity we dubbed Mount Splashmore. Setting everything up was harder than we'd expected. The slide refused to stay upright at first, flopping over like an oversized pool noodle. Jake and Chris argued over which hose attachment would give the sprinklers the best spray radius, their bickering echoing across the empty lawn. At one point, Mia tripped while pouring soap into the kiddie pool, ending up soaked in green foam. It was impossible not to laugh. By 2:30 a.m., we were ready. The sprinklers roared to life, spraying arcs of water high into the air. Mount Splashmore stood proudly in the center, a beacon of juvenile ingenuity. We took turns testing the slide, shrieking with laughter as we landed in the soapy abyss below. It felt surreal, like we'd turned our dull, oppressive school into a playground for the unhinged. For a moment, we forgot the risk and just reveled in the sheer absurdity of it all. Around 4 a.m., we knew it was time to flee. The sprinklers were still running, churning the lawn into a frothy swamp. The kiddie pool, now an unholy green cauldron, was left as is, a final touch of mayhem. We packed up in record time, leaving no trace except for the destruction we'd wrought. As we drove away, we couldn't stop talking about how the faculty would react when they arrived in a few hours. Monday morning came, and we walked into school with feigned innocence. We didn't have to wait long for the chaos to erupt. The moment the first bell rang, whispers spread like wildfire. "Did you see the front lawn? I heard it's a total swamp." Someone said they saw a giant slide. By the time second period rolled around, the principal called an emergency assembly. He stormed onto the stage, his face as red as a stop sign. Behind him, a photo of the flooded, foam-covered lawn was projected onto a screen. The sight was even more glorious than we'd imagined. This utter disrespect for school property, he bellowed, shaking a finger at the audience. The perpetrators will be found and punished to the fullest extent. His outrage only made it funnier. We exchanged smirks, knowing we'd covered our tracks well. The janitor, however, wasn't as amused. Rumor had it he quit on the spot after seeing the mess, muttering something about damn kids and not worth minimum wage. In the weeks that followed, the school took drastic measures to prevent future pranks. New security cameras were installed, and the custodial staff was doubled. But despite their efforts, they never caught us. It became a point of pride. We were untouchable. The prank took on a life of its own. Students who weren't even involved started claiming credit, adding exaggerated details to the story. One version had us riding jet skis through the lagoon of chaos. Another claimed we'd hidden live frogs in the kiddie pool. The truth didn't matter. the legend was enough. Months later, an unexpected consequence emerged. The constant watering had created the perfect conditions for mushrooms to sprout in the lawn. When the grounds crew removed the sod, they discovered a thriving fungi ecosystem. The biology teacher turned it into a class project, dubbing it the Mushroom Incident. Extra credit was awarded to anyone who could identify the species growing there. The irony didn't stop there. A year later, the school introduced an official event called the Lagoon Festival as a fundraiser. They rented water slides, set up sprinklers, and even provided a foam machine. It was fun, sure, but it lacked the thrill of rebellion. As we watched the underclassmen frolic in the sanitized version of our chaos, we couldn't help but feel a bit smug. Even now, years later, it's a story we laugh about at every reunion. It wasn't just a prank. It was a moment of pure, unfiltered joy. And though the lawn has long since recovered, the memory of Mount Splashmore and the Lagoon of Chaos remains untouchable, just like us. Let's start a new story. This morning, I woke up to what I can only describe as the most surreal, yet oddly delightful experience of my life. At first, everything seemed normal. Sunlight streaming through my curtains, my alarm buzzing insistently, and the faint smell of coffee lingering from the auto timer on my machine. But then, as I reached for the alarm clock, it said, quite indignantly, "About time. I've been screaming my guts out for 5 whole minutes. Do you even appreciate how precise my timing is?" I froze. I didn't even hit snooze, just stared at the clock in shock. And it stared back, the little digital numbers blinking judgmentally. Then my pillow, soft and squishy as always, chimed in, "You've got the heaviest head, you know that? Every night, it's like hosting a bowling ball convention, and I never get a thank you." By the time my bedsheet complained about being rumpled beyond recognition and my slipper chuckled about the ticklishness of my toes, I realized 2 things. 1, either I'd gone insane, or 2, everything in my house was alive and chatty. Oddly enough, I was calm about both possibilities. As I shuffled into the kitchen in a daze, the fridge greeted me with a cheerful, "Hey, good morning. Want some milk? It's a bit past its prime, but the juice says you'll survive." I opened the fridge door, and every bottle and jar suddenly had a personality. The orange juice was smooth and slightly pretentious. A mimosa is the only proper use for me, darling. While the ketchup was salty, not in taste, but in attitude, muttering about how it's always last to the party and nobody respects condiments anymore. The toaster was particularly intense, as it muttered dramatically, "I'll turn this bread to ash if I don't get some recognition around here." I told it to calm down and popped in some bread, to which it hissed, "Fine, but I'm watching you." The entire morning was like this. My toothbrush gave me a lecture on my aggressive brushing technique, and the sink debated the merits of hot versus cold water like it was an esteemed academic. Even my bath mat had something to say. "You know, there's a point where the whole wet foot thing gets old. A little more drying off, please." I thought stepping outside might offer some relief from the chaos, but oh no, things took a whole new turn out there. Birds chirped as usual, except this time I understood every word. A sparrow perched on my mailbox told me the latest gossip about the neighborhood cats. The tabby's been sneaking into the Siamese's yard at night. Can you believe that scandal? Meanwhile, the squirrels were haggling over some stolen acorns, shouting insults at each other like tiny, fuzzy mob bosses. When I got into my car, it was waiting to pounce on me with snark. "Another Monday morning, huh? You know you could vacuum me once in a while. I'm not your personal trash can." I had to apologize and promise it a car wash to get it to stop sulking. Driving to work was equally bizarre. Every streetlight had an opinion about my speed. Too fast. "You think I've got reflexes like a cheetah?" And the stop sign grumbled about how it's the unsung hero of traffic safety. When I arrived at the office, I didn't dare touch my keyboard, fearing it would critique my typing style or berate me for deleting emails too aggressively. But what really caught me off guard was the vending machine in the break room. I just wanted a bag of chips, and instead I got a rant about how nobody buys the granola bars, and it's affecting the machine's sense of purpose. I ended up apologizing and buying a granola bar out of sheer guilt, to which the machine said, "That's more like it," in the smuggest tone imaginable. By the time I got home, I was equal parts exhausted and entertained. My sofa was already griping about how I plopped down too hard, and my TV refused to turn on until I promised not to watch trashy reality shows. I had to convince the microwave that yes, I really did need to reheat the leftovers again. And no, I wasn't just being lazy. It's been like this all day, and honestly, I kind of love it. Sure, everything is mildly annoying, but it's also hilarious and surprisingly comforting. Who knew my furniture and appliances had such strong personalities? Or that the neighborhood squirrels were running an underground nut racket? The world feels bigger and weirder and so much more alive now, and I can't stop smiling about it. So here's my question. If you could have a day in a reality as wonderfully weird as this, where everything has a voice and a mind of its own, would you? Or would the constant sass drive you absolutely nuts? Let's start a new story. Every night after dinner, when the dishes were stacked in the sink and the hum of the day was starting to settle, we'd go for our walk. It wasn't something we planned or even discussed. More like a habit that formed quietly, like a patch of wildflowers blooming where you didn't think anything could grow. The moment I'd push back my chair, she'd already be standing, slipping her hand into mine as if it had always belonged there. The door would creak open, and we'd step into the night, the cool air brushing our cheeks, the rhythm of our steps syncing like the beat of an old familiar song. It started when we moved into that tiny one-bedroom apartment. We didn't have much. A couch that sagged in the middle, a coffee table we found on the curb, and mismatched plates from my college days. But there was this path behind the complex, a narrow trail that wound its way through a grove of eucalyptus trees before opening up to a small park. The first time we walked it, we were just looking for a way to kill time. We didn't know it would become our thing. Some nights, we'd barely talk, just listen to the crunch of gravel underfoot and the rustling of leaves overhead. Other nights, we'd pour our hearts out. I still remember the night she told me she hated her job, how the weight of it was crushing her, and I held her hand a little tighter, telling her we'd figure it out. Or the time I admitted I didn't know if I was good enough for her, and she stopped dead in her tracks, turned to me with those fierce, unyielding eyes and said, "Don't you dare think that. Don't you ever think that." Then there were the nights we laughed so hard we had to stop walking, clutching our sides as we replayed some stupid joke from earlier in the day. One time, a neighbor's dog got loose and decided to join us, trotting along like he was part of our little ritual. By the time we got back, his owner was waiting, trying to look stern but failing miserably when the dog refused to leave our side. Winter walks were my favorite. She'd bundle up in her oversized coat, the one she swore was ugly, but I secretly loved because it made her look like she was wrapped in a cloud. Her breath would puff out in tiny clouds, and her nose would turn the faintest shade of pink. I'd slip my arm around her to keep her warm, and she'd lean into me, her hair brushing against my cheek. I didn't care if my fingers froze or my ears went numb. Those moments felt like a kind of magic, like we were the only two people in the world. Sometimes the walks would end at the park, where we'd sit on the swings like a couple of kids. She'd pump her legs, trying to see how high she could go, and I'd pretend to be unimpressed, even though I loved the way her laughter echoed into the night. Other times, we'd just keep walking, letting the path lead us until we were too tired to go any further. And when we'd finally turn back, there was this quiet sense of contentment, like we'd somehow left the world lighter than we found it. Even when life got busier, when her job started demanding longer hours, and I was juggling more than I thought I could handle, we still made time. It wasn't always the full walk. Some nights, it was just a quick loop around the block, her hand still in mine, her head resting on my shoulder. "It's not the distance," she'd say, "it's the together." We don't live in that apartment anymore. We've got a house now, with a yard big enough for our dog to roam. And the path, the eucalyptus trees, the little park, they're all a memory, tucked away like a favorite book you don't need to open to remember every word. We don't take walks as often these days. Life has a way of filling up the spaces you once thought were endless. But every now and then, when the dishes are done and the night feels just right, one of us will grab the other's hand, and we'll step out into the quiet. We don't talk about it, don't call it a tradition, or try to name it. It's just us walking the way we always have. What about you? What little rituals add warmth to your relationships? Let's start a new story. There's a part of me that always feels like I'm sitting cross-legged on the carpet of my childhood living room, even now. That carpet was this impossibly ugly shade of beige, but it was warm under my legs, and it smelled like the faintest trace of popcorn and our dog's favorite spot to nap. My parents had this huge wooden entertainment center, one of those monsters that took up an entire wall and had glass doors where we kept the VHS tapes. Every movie we ever watched as a family lived there, from The Lion King to those grainy recordings of holiday specials my dad taped off TV, commercials and all. I remember how my sister and I would argue over which tape to watch, even though the answer was always the same, something we'd already seen 100 times. We'd end up making a whole event out of it, grabbing snacks, turning off the lights, and settling in for the kind of evening that felt like the whole world had paused just for us. The remote was always missing, of course, and we'd have to get up to press those chunky buttons on the VCR. I can still hear the whirring and clicking as the tape rewound, the anticipation building with every second. There was something sacred about the moment the title screen flickered on and the tracking smoothed out. It was magic. Outside, the world was always simpler too. Summer nights meant sitting on the curb with the kids from down the street, catching fireflies in mason jars, or just lying back on the grass to stare up at the stars. We thought we'd discovered the meaning of life when we realized you could blow on dandelions and make a wish. I can still feel the soft crush of sneakers on the road and the smell of someone grilling a few doors down. It was that kind of humid warmth that makes you sleepy, even though you don't want the night to end. If it was winter, everything shifted indoors. My best friend and I would huddle around a little heater in her basement, passing her family's old Nokia back and forth to play Snake. That was the peak of technology as far as we were concerned, and I was terrible at it, but the hours slipped away all the same. Her mom would bring us mugs of cocoa in mismatched mugs, always with too many marshmallows, and we'd talk about the things we swore we'd never forget. Crushes, embarrassing moments, and our plans for when we were grown-ups. It's funny how serious those conversations felt back then, like we were solving puzzles the world hadn't figured out yet. Music was its own kind of time machine. My dad had this old boombox in the garage, and he'd blast classic rock while fixing the car or organizing his endless collection of tools. I'd sit there on a paint-speckled stool, pretending to be helpful, but mostly just flipping through his CD cases. He had this rule: if you could name the artist before the chorus hit, you got $1. I almost never got it right, but it didn't matter. The songs became the soundtrack of those moments, sticking to me like glue. Even now, if I hear Hotel California or More Than a Feeling, I'm right back there, smelling motor oil and freshly cut grass. And then there were the little rituals, the kind you don't even realize are rituals until they're gone. The Saturday morning bike rides to the corner store, where I'd spend my carefully hoarded allowance on packs of gum and those sticky slap hands that never worked quite right. The way my mom always insisted on making pancakes on the first day of school, even though none of us were morning people. Or how my friends and I would meet up at this shabby little diner after football games, cramming into a booth that was too small for us, and splitting a basket of fries like we hadn't just eaten half a pizza at someone's house. Sometimes it's the simplest things that hit the hardest. The feel of those tiny flip phones with real buttons, and how you could send a text without looking if you knew the keypad well enough. The way every mall seemed to have the same smell, a mix of Auntie Anne's pretzels and overly sweet perfume from the department store, or the soft glow of streetlights through the fogged-up window of a car as you drove home, tired but happy, with the radio playing low in the background. I'm not saying everything was better back then. I'm not wearing rose-tinted glasses about it. Life wasn't perfect, and we had our share of tough moments too. But when I think back to those times, I can't help but feel this quiet, bittersweet kind of happiness, like I'm holding a snow globe of memories and watching the glitter swirl around. They're not gone, not really. They're just tucked away, waiting for me to pick them up and revisit them when I need to feel the warmth of them again. What about you? What little thing from the past always brings a smile to your face when you remember it? Let's start a new story. The house where I grew up didn't feel like a home anymore. I'd been gone for over a decade, and stepping back into it was like walking into a replica that didn't get all the details right. The furniture was the same, but faded. The kitchen smelled like detergent instead of cinnamon rolls. The living room felt smaller, though I suspected it was me who'd grown larger in all the wrong ways. I stood in the doorway, suitcase in hand, waiting for Mom to come downstairs and greet me, but the air was thick with absence. She appeared finally, slower than I remembered, her steps uneven on the creaky stairs. "You look good," she said, her voice too bright, as if it could smooth over the years and silence that had settled between us. I gave her the kind of smile you offer strangers in line at the grocery store, small and polite. It was all I could manage. She hugged me, her arms thin and bird-like. I tried not to notice the slight shake in her hands when she patted my back. Come in. Your room's all set up." "My room," I said under my breath, following her down the hallway to the narrow door at the end. It wasn't mine anymore. I'd left it behind with a stack of unpaid bills, a trail of broken relationships, and dreams that had curdled into regrets. I wasn't the person who belonged to that room, or this house, or even this version of my mother. But here I was. The room smelled like lavender air freshener and something faintly metallic. The bed was made with a quilt I didn't recognize, and my old posters, bands I hadn't listened to since college, had been carefully retaped to the walls. She must have done it recently. I could still smell the adhesive. "Looks just like you left it," she said, smiling nervously. I didn't have the heart to tell her it looked like someone had staged my childhood for a museum exhibit. "Thanks, Mom," I said instead, setting my suitcase down by the bed. Dinner was reheated leftovers, the kind of mismatched meal cobbled together from freezer bags and forgotten Tupperware. Mom filled the silence with stories I couldn't follow, about neighbors whose names I didn't know, church bake sales, and a new postman who was quite the looker. I nodded at all the right places, my fork moving aimlessly across my plate. "Do you think you'll stay long?" she asked, her voice casual, but her eyes too eager. "I don't know," I said, focusing on my potatoes. She hesitated, her hands twitching around her napkin. "You know you're always welcome here." I wanted to tell her that wasn't true, that houses could outgrow people, that sometimes a welcome didn't feel like an invitation. But I nodded again and said, "Thanks." The attic project was her idea, of course. "It's been cluttered for years," she said over breakfast one morning, sliding a plate of toast and eggs toward me. "I thought it might be nice to go through everything together. Make some space." "Sure," I said, not because I wanted to, but because it was easier than saying no. The attic smelled like dust and ghosts. We hauled box after box into the light, the cardboard soft and sagging at the edges. "Oh, look," Mom said, holding up an old soccer jersey. "You used to love this." I stared at it, trying to summon the boy who once wore it. But he felt as distant as the stars, someone I'd read about in a book years ago and only half remembered. "Yeah," I said finally. "I guess I did." We unearthed photo albums, trophies, school projects, and knickknacks whose origins neither of us could recall. Every now and then, she'd pull something out with a gasp. "Oh, Sam, do you remember this?" And I'd nod even when I didn't. It wasn't until we found the blanket that I felt anything real. It was tucked at the bottom of a box, frayed and faded but unmistakable. My childhood blanket, the one I dragged everywhere until it disintegrated into threads. The one Mom used to patch up late at night, her hands steady and sure as she worked the needle. "You loved that thing," she said softly, her smile turning wistful. "Wouldn't go anywhere without it." I picked it up, the fabric stiff with age. It smelled like the attic, like time and distance and 1,000 other things I couldn't name. My throat tightened, and I wasn't sure if it was sadness or guilt or just the weight of too many memories. "Yeah," I said, my voice catching. "I remember." That night, I sat on the porch with a beer, watching the neighborhood settle into its usual quiet. A couple of kids rode bikes down the street, their laughter echoing faintly in the distance. The air was cool, the kind of cool that hinted at rain, but didn't promise it. I thought about the attic, about the boxes we'd sorted, about the person I used to be. I thought about my mom, about the way her hands shook when she poured her tea, and how her smiles always seemed a little too bright. I thought about the silence that had grown between us, filling up all the spaces where words used to be. And I thought about the blanket, folded neatly in the passenger seat of my car, waiting for me to decide what to do with it. When I finally went back inside, Mom was asleep in her chair, the TV flickering quietly in the corner. I covered her with a different blanket, one without holes or memories, and whispered, "Good night." I didn't know if I'd stay or leave, if I'd find a way back to the life I'd abandoned or build something new from the rubble. But for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I had to decide right away. Maybe I thought that was enough. Let's start a new story. I woke up this morning like any other, groggy, and with a half-formed thought about how I should probably start doing yoga or something because my back sounds like bubble wrap every time I roll out of bed. I shuffled to the kitchen, ready to embrace my daily ritual of coffee and mild existential dread, when I noticed something strange. My coffee maker was glowing. Not just a little light on the power button. No, the whole thing was bathed in this soft, pulsing, golden light, like it had been possessed by the spirit of a Pinterest influencer. Naturally, I poked it. That's what you do when something inexplicably glows in your house at 6:45 a.m., right? The moment my finger touched it, the whole room shifted. Not like the dramatic whoosh of sci-fi movies, but more like someone had pulled the background of my kitchen away like it was a cheap stage prop. Suddenly, I wasn't standing in my cluttered kitchen with a sink full of dishes. No, I was in a meadow. A sunny, ridiculously picturesque meadow that looked like it had been photoshopped by someone with an unhealthy obsession with fairy tales. At first, I thought I was dreaming. Then I looked down and realized I was still wearing my ancient Star Wars pajama pants and mismatched socks. So either I'd been transported somewhere, or my subconscious was going for embarrassingly realistic. That's when I noticed the creatures. A group of bunnies. Yes, bunnies were lined up in front of me, all wearing tiny waistcoats and top hats. One of them, the leader I guess, stepped forward and tipped his hat. "Greetings, noble traveler," he said in a voice that can only be described as somewhere between David Attenborough and your overly polite grandfather. I did what any normal person would do when confronted with talking rabbits in formal wear. I froze and stared, hoping I hadn't finally cracked from the pressure of adulting. But the bunny leader seemed unfazed by my silence. He explained, very patiently, that I'd been chosen by the Council of Fluff to complete a quest of great importance. Apparently, their enchanted carrot supply had been stolen by the Dark One, who I later found out is a rather grumpy badger named Steve. "Why me?" I asked, genuinely curious. I am not, by any stretch of the imagination, quest material. My cardio consists of running to the microwave before my popcorn burns. But the bunny just smiled and said, "Because you touched the glowing artifact. Fate has chosen you. So now it's my coffee maker's fault," which honestly tracks. That thing has been temperamental for years. They handed me a sword. And when I say sword, I mean a glorified toothpick with a hilt. The bunnies cheered as I held it up, which was equal parts adorable and concerning. One of them handed me a map that looked like it had been drawn by a preschooler after a sugar binge. And off I went. The quest itself was a lot. The forest was alive, and not in a metaphorical, the trees are whispering way. The trees actually whispered, mostly unhelpful things like, "Nice socks, and shouldn't you be wearing shoes?" Birds flew by, chirping what I'm 90% sure was the theme from Mission Impossible. At one point, I tripped over a root that popped up out of nowhere, and the tree just laughed. Rude. When I finally reached the lair of Steve the Badger, I wasn't sure what to expect. A dungeon? A dark, creepy cave? Nope. Steve was sitting in a hammock outside a cozy little burrow, wearing sunglasses and sipping what looked suspiciously like a mojito. He didn't even look surprised to see me. "You here for the carrots?" he asked, gesturing to a pile of glowing vegetables next to him. I nodded, holding up my toothpick sword in what I hoped was a threatening manner. He sighed. "Look, I didn't steal them. The bunnies owe me rent. I'm just holding on to these until they pay up." "Rent?" The bunnies hadn't mentioned that part. I tried to argue, but Steve just handed me a carrot and said, "Take one. Tell them it's a goodwill gesture, or whatever." So there I was, standing in a meadow again, holding one glowing carrot while the bunnies surrounded me, hopping and cheering like I'd just saved the world. They didn't seem too concerned about the rest of the carrots, and honestly, I didn't have the energy to explain badger economics. When I finally woke up back in my kitchen, I was holding a regular carrot, which was a little disappointing. The coffee maker wasn't glowing anymore, just sitting there innocently like it hadn't dragged me into a woodland rent dispute. I made my coffee, ate the carrot because why not, and sat down to process the weirdest morning of my life. So now I have to ask, if you woke up in a meadow and were handed a quest by waistcoat-wearing bunnies, what would you do? Would you take the toothpick sword and go full hero mode? Or would you try to negotiate with the badger? Also, has anyone else's coffee maker done this? Or is it just mine?